into doing so. There are tough choices, and especially with a fixed top line, it will be a significant challenge for Congress to make these choices in a way that reflects the long-term security interests of the country. I also want to say I appreciate the efforts the Secretary has made for the defense-wide review. It is something we have talked about in this committee, trying to get more value out of the taxpayer dollars for the benefit of the warfighter. And again, we may agree or disagree with some of the specific choices, but the point is trying to not only make reductions in some areas, but to make reforms also that can result in more for the warfighter. I have to also make some comments about the recent reprogramming. Article 1, Section 8 says it's Congress's responsibility, not just our authority, but our responsibility to provide and maintain, raise and support, make the rules and regulations for the military forces of the United States. There have been decades, literally decades, of practice where if there are changing needs, money can be moved within the department budget with the approval of Congress. That has not taken place in this most recent reprogramming. Now, you can argue that last year there was the MILCON and the other thing, but there was excess funds in the Army personnel account because they didn't meet their recruiting goals, and so that money could be used for other purposes. This year is very different. This is not taking excess funds. This is substituting the judgment of the department for, and actually the administration. This, I think, my opinion is, this is not totally at the discretion of the Secretary. It is substituting the judgment of the administration for the judgment of Congress by reducing specific weapon systems that had been authorized and appropriated. We made a different judgment call than the administration's budget request. And in effect, what the administration does is say, we don't care what has been authorized and appropriated, we're going to do what we darn well want. In this room, as long as I've been in here, I think a fair amount about the guy that's just to the right of the TV screen there, Carl Vinson, for whom this room is named. In his History of the Second World War, Victor David Hansen said that the American fleet that broke the back of the Japanese Navy in 1943-44 was designed and approved before Pearl Harbor, mostly through the efforts of one naval visionary, Congressman Carl Vinson, chairman of the House Naval Affairs Committee, who from 34 to 40 pushed through 5 successive bills to expand and reconfigure the Navy. In other words, he had a different judgment call than the Roosevelt administration, and because of what he did, we were able to break the back of the Japanese Navy in 1943-45. Different judgment calls we've made, and the list is long. Predators, MRAPs, ISR aircraft, A-10s. We have made different judgment calls for years. And while our history, again, is not perfect, it looks pretty good. But to me, it's not just that sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. It is the constitutional issue. And let me just quote again Carl Vinson, because he got into a tussle with the second Secretary of Defense, Lewis Johnson. And he said, Congress provides the forces, the President commands them. If we ever get this principle of our government distorted, our whole fabric of government will be in jeopardy. It is whether the Congress will say what kind of defense the nation will have, or whether the creature of the Congress, the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Lewis Johnson, will tell us what kind of defense he will let the Congress have. This is a deeper issue than the wall. I support physical barriers on the border. I support walls, but I am deeply concerned about where we're headed with the constitutional issue about Congress's role in national defense and whether that is being overridden. We need to hit on all cylinders in national defense. There are too many challenges out there for us. And I'm afraid that the result of this will be greater restrictions on the department's ability to move money around, to meet changing needs, and the country will suffer as a result. I hope I'm proved wrong, but I'm concerned about where this is headed. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2021. I'm joined today by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. The 2018 National Defense Strategy provides a clear roadmap for the Department of Defense to address the reemergence of long-term strategic competition from near-peer competitors, China, then Russia. Throughout the Pentagon and the Joint Force, the NDS guides our decisions and actions as we adapt the force to simultaneously contend with the threats of today while preparing for the challenges of tomorrow. We do this by increasing the readiness and lethality of our warfighters, strengthening our alliances and partnerships, and reforming the way that the Department does business. Additionally, we have placed renewed emphasis on taking care of our service members and their families. The Department is grateful for the strong support provided in the FY20 NDAA and DoD appropriations, which allowed us to make vital investments in our military's modernization, enabled the creation of the United States Space Force, and provide our service members with the largest pay increase in a decade. Our continued success is contingent upon predictable, adequate, sustained, and timely funding, and I encourage Congress to pass a full-year spending package for FY21 on time to avoid the debilitating effects of another continuing resolution. The Department's total FY21 budget request is $705.4 billion. This represents a minor increase from the FY20 enacted amount of $704.6 billion, but does not keep pace with inflation. Given this flattened funding level, we were required to make many tough decisions to ensure our highest priorities were adequately funded. To enable our decision-making, we conducted a comprehensive defense-wide review aimed at reallocating resources from programs and activities that offer low return on investment relative to the goals and objectives of the NDS. Over a 4-month period, we conducted over 20 review sessions examining almost $100 billion in programs, agencies, and activities that make up the Fourth Estate. This review generated $5.7 billion in FY21 savings that were reinvested back into readiness and lethality efforts. Each of the military services is also instituting a similar review process across their budgets to achieve the same outcome of realigning resources and finding savings that can be reinvested into higher priorities. Additionally, this is the third review, I've initiated the process of conducting full reviews of all combatant commands, to properly align our global military posture to the NDS. This effort will enable the Department to shift greater emphasis to our higher priority region, the Indo-Pacific, or allow us to return troops home to build readiness. Thus far, we have ongoing reviews of AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM, and will expand to other commands over the coming months. My recent decision to deploy elements of an Army Security Force Assistance Brigade to Africa to replace units from a brigade combat team is an example of how this process is enabling us to better match resources to the mission of each combatant command. The Department's FY21 budget reflects this same disciplined adherence to the NDS. To preserve our overmatch, we have made significant investments into several critical technologies that will alter the future battlefield. Our RDT&E budget is the largest in our history and prioritizes hypersonics, microelectronics, 5G communications, autonomous systems, and artificial intelligence. We are moving forward with long overdue recapitalization of the nation's nuclear triad, with key investments in the ground-based strategic deterrent, the B-21 stealth bomber, the Columbia-class submarine, and improved nuclear command, control, and communication systems, to name a few. We are also enhancing our missile defense capabilities to protect against the growing threat of advanced enemy missile defense systems. This budget request expands our capacity to defend our interests in space as we consolidate much of our space enterprise into the Space Force. It also advances the Department's cyber capabilities, allowing us to protect our digital infrastructure while disrupting covert foreign malign activity. This includes defending the integrity of our democracy by assisting in the security of our elections. The Department appreciates this committee's advocacy of the National Defense Strategy, and we value Congress's guidance on reform. I now ask for your support so that we may fully implement our decisions and move forward with the investments needed to ensure America's military maintains our competitive advantage, continues to deter conflict, and preserves our nation's security. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Secretary Esper here today. It's my distinct honor and privilege to represent the almost 3 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians of the United States Armed Forces, the best trained, best equipped, and best led military force in the world, and we cannot do it without your continued support. This budget is a strategy-driven budget. It is driven by the NDS, which you are fully aware of, and I fully support. We stand ready and capable today to deter war, defend our homeland from attack, support our allies, and fight and win our nation's wars against any potential adversary anywhere on the Earth's surface or subsurface. But our competitive advantage has eroded, and no one should have any doubt about that. China and Russia are increasing their military capabilities to outmatch the United States and its allies in order to exert their global influence. North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations fuel regional instability and pose threats to partner nations and U.S. citizens. And while the nature of war is constant, advanced technologies have stressed our industrial age capabilities, concepts, and processes, changing the very character of war in a fundamental way. Additionally, we are recovering from readiness shortfalls and modernization deferments over about 20 years now of continuous warfare and a decade of budget instability. This year's budget builds on previous readiness and modernization gains, and I believe the 21 budget submission is the best allocation of resources. It's balanced in support of the National Defense Strategy. It builds a more lethal force, it strengthens allies and partners, and it reforms the Department for greater performance and affordability. It also prioritizes, as the Secretary said, the Indo-Pacific region to deter Chinese aggression, maintain stability, and ensure access to the common domains in order to preserve a free and open international system. Additionally, this budget accounts for continued efforts in Europe to counter Russian aggression, and it will continue to allow the United States military, in concert with our allies and partners, to deter a provocative North Korea or Iran from aggressive actions in their regions while conducting counterterrorist operations in various parts of the world. In short, PB 21 supports a ready, agile, and capable joint force that can compete, deter, and win across all domains today and in the future. And it targets specific investments in readiness, modernization, leader development, and support to our people, our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen, and our families. It invests in our readiness recovery that was built over the last 3 years. And with this committee's support, all services are scheduled to meet their readiness recovery goals inside this FYDP. It funds modernization for great power competition across all the warfighting domains, and it improves the safety, security, reliability of our nuclear enterprise. It invests and stands up the Space Force and increases the resiliency, deterrence, capability, and warfighting options in both space and cyber. It funds joint all-domain command and control to improve our interoperability across all the services and with our allies, and invests in advanced technologies that the Secretary listed to address more complex threats and a faster pace in this changing character of war. This budget invests also, and finally, in our most valued asset, the United States Armed Forces, our people. It also funds facilities, infrastructure, family support, and quality of life programs, and it invests in the education and talent management processes to develop our junior leaders with the values and intellectual ability to fight and win future conflicts, the captains and ensigns of today who will be the admirals and generals of tomorrow. Ultimately, our military needs sustained, predictable, adequate, and timely funding to retain its competitive advantage in this era of great power competition. With the understanding that we must be good stewards of the resources entrusted to us by Congress and the American people, I want to thank this committee for your continued support to our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and our families, and I look forward to asking or answering your questions.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to question and answer. As we go through, we've got a lot of people. It's going to be very difficult to get through. The one thing is every member has 5 minutes. And as I've said before, you can't ask the question for 4 minutes and 45 seconds and then get a 3-minute answer. I will try to let you gentlemen finish, but as we hit 5 minutes, if you could wrap up so we can move on to the next one, that would enable us to get to as many members as possible. I just want to ask about the blank slate review and just start from that point. If you could give us a little insight into how that worked, and AFRICOM is where you started. So if you could just well, I mean, obviously there were other issues there. AFRICOM was the first command that you looked at. And there's been a lot of press reporting on this, most of it inaccurate, I'm aware. But if you could tell us, when you looked at it, did you contemplate, well, let's just pull all the forces out of Africa? Was that contemplated? If so, how far did that get? And then what was the analysis in terms of how you looked at our interests in Africa and the role that our forces could play and the risks that you were balancing, where you were going to send them? Just walk us through a little bit the specifics of how you did that, because this is one piece of what you're going to be doing in a lot of other places as well.
So first of all, Mr. Chairman, there are 3 reviews ongoing right now. I mentioned them in my opening statement. One is review the combatant commands. I'll talk about that here in a minute. The second is the defense-wide review led by the CMO. And the third are the service reviews of their budgets. With regard to the combatant command reviews, you hit the nail on the head at the beginning. What I'm trying to do is make sure we are aligned to the NDS, but secondly, that we can get into better equilibrium, demand, which is way up here, and supply, which is down here. This is what's driving our force in the ground, in many instances, in burning readiness. And so the way we began this process, concurrently with the Joint Staff, what the Joint Staff did was looked at all the combatant commands and went through 2 or 3 decades worth and discovered that these respective commands all have hundreds of tasks and requirements placed on them that the combatant commanders are working hard to achieve and resource. And that review is ongoing. In the case of AFRICOM, it was easily over 1,000. So as we looked at each command, what I want to make sure as I gave guidance to them is to make sure that they came back to me and presented a range of options that made sure that we prioritize what we need to do. First, do you have the resources you need to meet your wartime and your contingency plans? Second, great power competition. And then third, it starts becoming unique to the theater. In the case of AFRICOM, what are your missions with regard to counterterrorism and how are you resourcing it? With Southcom, it's the same first 2, but the third becomes counter-drug, counter-narcotics, and there's some other missions. And then what we've been engaging now on over a series of months are back and forth as we look at different questions and issues and considerations. There are no plans to completely withdraw all forces from Africa. That's been misreported and repeated over and over again. But what I am looking to do is to make sure that I can resource the missions that are actually required and to right-size the force consistent with that and the need to build readiness across the force so I can deal with China, then Russia, as part of the NDS.
Can you give us just an example of something you've identified in any one of those reviews where it's like, yeah, that's something we don't need to do anymore? And I'm not saying that it's unimportant or irrelevant, but you looked at it and said, we need to move off of that because it's not the best use of our dollars in that case, whether in Africa or in the services or wherever.
Well, no decisions have been made yet on Southcom. The only decision I've made so far in AFRICOM was to replace a regular infantry unit from the 101st with a Security Force Assistance Brigade. It makes great sense in terms of great power competition because a Security Force Assistance Brigade is trained, organized, equipped to do that mission, to provide training that's important to forces on the ground as we try and make sure we compete and improve their capabilities. Whereas an infantry battalion doesn't have that. The infantry battalion, in this case, need to go back home so they can prepare for great power competition. So that's an example where just swapping out the forces really gets your great power competition to a different level. So that's a case in point. We have found in the theaters, and the chairman may want to speak to this, over the years we've stacked up crisis response forces and have held them pending, and in cases we never actually use them. And so we're looking at how do we make sure we get those special operation forces and others back to where we can meet the needs if there's a crisis, but at the same token not allow the others to go back and retain a better readiness posture. That is one issue that's coming up. I have not made any decisions on that yet, but that's something that I think we all recognize. The chairman may want to comment on that one about these are the things that we are uncovering, and we are uncovering a lot of things as we go through this process.
Just very briefly, pick the red pen up first. We have to do an intel analysis of not only the globe, but in specific areas. So do a rigorous intelligence analysis of the actual threats that are in Africa relative to our national security vital interests. Take terrorism as an example. There's a lot of terrorist organizations in groups in Africa. Not all are created equal. So we got to parse all of those out, determine which ones are actual threats to the United States, and make sure we right size and we have the right type of force in the right place at the right time to meet that. Same thing with China, Russia, and great power competition, for example, in Africa. Are they at the right place, right time, and so on? We have multiple things that have been built up over 20, 30 years in X-Wards and Op-Wards and we're going through that and editing it and making sure that it's rational, rational in accordance with the NDS. The Secretary mentioned the crisis response forces, but there's other things out there. Take the Sinai, for example. Camp David Accord signed in 1981. I served in the Sinai. Is that still a valid mission for U.S. military forces? Yes, no. Arguments to be made on both sides. We're going through all that kind of stuff, every single task and purpose out there for the United States military, from space down to undersea. Does it still make sense in accordance with the NDS? Is it warranted with this changing character of war, and so on? And if yes, check, continue, pass go, collect 200. If not, then we delete it.
Thank you.
I was in, just a quick anecdote, I was in Stratcom last week. Admiral Richard, who runs Stratcom, has a tasking on his books that dates to the 1960s. He can't even find out where it came from. And in the present context, it doesn't make any sense. And so as I had my initial discussion with him about his review, those are the things we're trying to undo, because if you look at the mission, if it doesn't make sense, it frees up resources, time, money, and manpower that I can put back into higher priority things.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Thornberry.
Mr. Secretary, we are about to embark on trying to write a defense authorization bill for what would be the 59th straight year if it's signed into law. And I guess my basic question to you is it going to matter? Or will OMB send down a directive saying we don't, even though it's signed into law, authorized and appropriated, we're going to take away some money for some planes or satellites or something and move it to other things?
Mr. Thornberry, what the Congress does matters. It matters very much. And we look to the Congress as partners as we try and develop our game plan to serve the country, defend the country, and help us implement the NDS.
Well, as I've already expressed some of the concerns I have, I hope we can be partners because I think the country is stronger as a result. Mr. Chairman, let me just ask you briefly before we get into all of the should we spend more on this or less on that sort of questions. Help us provide some context for the situation we find ourselves in. If you were to give a brief description to the Rotary Club in Amarillo, Texas about how warfare has changed, in other words, the context for which tough choices have to be made, a different strategy has to be in place, how would you encapsulate that in a brief description?
I'm not sure it could be brief, Congressman Thornberry, but I guess as brief as I can. Technology has influenced warfare throughout the ages, and today is no different. And we're probably in one of the greatest shifts in the character of war, not the nature. Nature of war is all about politics, friction, uncertainty, et cetera, fear, violence. That's war, the nature of war. But the character of war changes very frequently. It changes largely driven by technology, but there's other reasons, societal reasons as well. But in today's day and age, it's changing very, very rapidly because of precision munitions. The ability of our sensors that are available to many, many countries, our ability to see and determine where people are, where things are throughout the world, and that which you can see, you can hit. The range at which we can engage is much, much longer today than it's ever been in human history. There's a wide variety of emerging technologies that are converging in time and space that are going to have significant military implication. Artificial intelligence is huge. Hypersonics, robotics, and there's a laundry list of about 20 or 30 additional emerging technologies. All of that is going to change the fundamental character of war, how we fight, the weapons we fight with, the methods, the doctrines, et cetera. We're living through that right now. What is really the challenge for the United States and for other countries is who is going to adapt to that changing character with the most speed, and who's going to have it about right. You're never going to get it perfect, but you got to get it right more than your adversary gets it right. And that's going to determine, in large respect, whether or not we prevail in some sort of conflict against our next adversary. There's a lot at stake here. This budget, what it does is it lays the foundations. It doesn't create that future for us, but it does lay the foundation with research, development, science, technology, and a few other lines of effort that lead us into the future.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of you. Thank you for your service, for joining us today. I want to follow up with both the chairman and the ranking member's comments regarding the transfer of funds that the Congress has not approved. As we know, there have been a lot of comments about budget predictability from Congress, and I appreciate that. I think that's the right way to go, of course. But could you tell us what funds are you planning on transferring to the wall in 2021 so that we can find a better use for those dollars now?
Thanks, Congresswoman. The funds, the sourcing would be from FY $20 that were either ahead of need or excess to need. In other words, not requested in the FY20 budget by the department.
If they, if they were not requested, and if they are not important, if they're not a high priority, why are they there? And aren't there many, many more uses that we have for those dollars?
They are there because Congress put them there.
If they are there because we put them there and you didn't believe that they were important or a high priority, was there a discussion about that, that you felt you couldn't change? And it seems to me that, you know, we have to be doing what's the most important. Mm-hmm. And the message that you're sending is that these projects, and some of them are critically important. Some of them involve major vehicles. The Air Force, there are so many things that have been touched by that, mm-hmm. that it sends a message that the military doesn't need that money. How do we respond then to constituents that see us cutting out areas where we made a strong commitment not to refill, to pay back those dollars, and yet, you know, we're sitting here without having been involved in that decision, the transfer decision specifically.
Sure. Look, I understand what you're saying, Congresswoman. The President has determined that we have a national emergency on our southwest border. That to deal with that emergency, that we need a barrier system, that barrier system development, which is led by DHS, requires the support of DOD. And that's our role in this process, supporting DHS.
Is the southern border security in the National Defense Strategy? Homeland
Security is in the National Defense Strategy, and it's one of the things that administrations have supported in the past with regard to security of the southern border.
Because I wanted to point out that the word border only appears once in the National Defense Strategy, and it's about Russia violating sovereign borders.
Right. Homeland Security is in the National Defense Strategy. There's a lot of things we do that aren't in the National Defense Strategy. We help people during floods. We help people during hurricanes. We help put out wildfires in the West. I mean, there's a lot of things that we do that aren't always captured, but it's the nature of what we do when the nation calls upon us to support.
Well, I think that if there are areas that you know that you're going to tap for part of your strategy on the border, which is not in the National Defense Strategy, then I think that's important for Congress to know, because you're telling us that that's not very important.
Congresswoman, there's a lot of things that we do that are not in the National Defense Strategy. That's what we're trying to clean up as we do our review here with the COCOMs and with the rest of the services.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Milley, if I could just turn to you for a second. The National Nuclear Security Administration still has about $8 billion left in unspent funds from last year, and that's half their FY20 budget. So is it in your best military advice that cutting a Virginia-class submarine to increase the NNSA's budget by 20% is good prioritization?
No, it is not. Ma'am, in that particular case, I wasn't personally involved in the decision on that. However, that was a case where there was some internal deliberations at the last minute to make sure that that the nuclear enterprise was fully funded.
Do you believe?
Well, let me just. So it's a question of. I wasn't personally in the meeting on that one. However. Had I been, I would have supported the fully funding of the nuclear enterprise. We have not had a great power war in 7.5 decades, 75 years, since World War II. A big reason for that is the United States nuclear enterprise. It's not the only reason. And I believe, and I said it in testimony previously, that the #1 priority of the United States, the budget, is to make sure that we have a safe, secure, guaranteed nuclear enterprise. And that's where that money...
We're going to have to, I apologize,
sorry.
we're going to have to leave it there because we're over
but
time.
I would have supported it.
Understood. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Esper and Chairman Milley, thank you for being with us here today to discuss the fiscal year 2021 Defense Authorization Budget request. The United States faces complex and dynamic security environments, and thankfully, President Donald Trump's budget for the national security matters promotes peace through strength. And Secretary Esper, I want to let you know how much I appreciated joining you touring and visiting the troops at Fort Jackson last year. And then you not only observed, but then you joined the troops in rappelling from the tower. And that was very impressive, your identification with our new trainees. Secretary Esper, American strategic nuclear forces are critical, as has been so correctly cited by Chairman Milley, to deterring our adversaries. President Trump has made clear his priority of the Department of Defense is to modernize our aging nuclear enterprises. Can you provide the committee with an update where China and Russia are with their nuclear capabilities and why we need to modernize and expand our American nuclear programs?
With respect to Russia, they are the only country on the earth that represents an actual, no-kidding, existential threat to the United States of America. Every man, woman, and child could be killed by the Russians. And we can do the same to them. And they know that, and we know that, hence mutually assured destruction, hence deterrence. So maintaining a guaranteed nuclear enterprise is critical relative to Russia. With respect to China, their nuclear enterprise is growing and growing rapidly. And us having a modernized nuclear enterprise is fundamental to the security of the United States in the out years. And we are at a point now where we have to modernize and invest in the triad in order to assure ourselves security in the future. It's very expensive, and I know that. We all recognize that. But it's absolutely critical to the security of the United States.
Thank you very much. And then, Secretary Esper, we're grateful that the U.S. Army Cyber Command is our next-door neighbor at Fort Gordon. It's important to defend our cyber networks and infrastructure. Acting Secretary of the Navy Thomas Modly said 5 days ago, it's not so much the top-tier suppliers, but it's the second and third-tier suppliers that have a lot of vulnerabilities that we've discovered, end of quote. What is being done by the Department to address this threat, and what industries are most vulnerable?
Mr. Wilson, I think as you, across the entire industrial base, as you move from the primes all the way down through the supply chain, the further you get out there, the more vulnerable they typically are to cyber influence, tampering, et cetera. So I know our folks in research and engineering and acquisition and sustainment are working on programs where we might be able to assist them with that surety. I met recently, had dinner with a number of company CEOs where we discussed the same issue, but we have to do a whole lot better job and help these extended tier, second, third, fourth tier suppliers improve their cybersecurity so that we have confidence in the systems once they come together and provide us that capability.
Thank you very much. And then Chairman Milley, I believe that the F-35 and fifth-generation aircraft are essential to securing and maintaining U.S. air superiority. However, as a multi-role fighter, can you tell us, from your perspective, what the F-35 brings to the fight in support of ground troops? How is the F-35 a game changer for the troops on the ground?
Well, as someone who has been in a fair share of ground contact, the very first call you ever make, frankly, when the bullets are flying, you call for attack helicopters or you call for close air support. And an F-35 is the premier fighter bomber in the world. It's an incredible aircraft. It's obviously very, very expensive, but it's an incredible aircraft. And it will be a significant weapon system in support of ground forces in the future. And it also, one thing on the air-to-air piece, is that the United States Army and Marine Corps have not come under sustained enemy air attack really since Normandy. And I think there was one attack during Vietnam or maybe the Korean War or something like that, but nothing sustained. Why is that? It's because we have the most unbelievable Air Force the world has ever seen. And we not only maintain air superiority, we get air supremacy across the board. And that's what that F-35 is all about, making sure that we don't lose soldiers and Marines on the ground from enemy air. So it'll clear the skies, maintain supremacy, and also perform a close air support role.
Well, we're grateful that F-35s are located at Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your testimony here today and for all you do on behalf of our nation and keeping us safe. I want to follow up just on commenting on the issue that my colleague, Ms. Davis, raised on the Virginia-class submarine. I want to express my very strong concern that the budget only includes one Virginia-class sub rather than two. This is against the recommendation of combatant commanders, while nuclear modernization, of course, is certainly important and very important. We shouldn't be financing it with funding for an attack submarine. So this is something that we're going to be very following closely through the NDA reauthorization process, the appropriation process, given the demands for Virginia-class submarines by our combatant commanders, and a very small percentage of the requests that they make really are only fulfilled. And our enemies and adversaries have a high build rate on submarines right now, and their growing capabilities. It's something that we need to be concerned about. I don't think that's an area that we can afford to be cutting. But that being said, I want to go to another issue on the issue of climate change. In FY18, and the NDA, I authored legislation that instructed each service to assess the risks of climate change on the military facilities. Secretary, I appreciate when you were Secretary of the Army, the list that you sent back to the committee identifying those bases. But the implications of climate change are indisputable. The department manages more than 1,700 military installations in worldwide coastal areas that may be affected by sea level rise. Hurricane Michael and Florence, just by way of example, caused an estimated $8.3 billion in damage. Secretary Esper, do you agree that the changing climate poses a threat to our readiness and ability to achieve military objectives?
Thank you, Mr. Langevin. I agree, as I think we reported as the chairman and I when we were at the Army, is that climate change poses a challenge for our installations and making sure that we can maintain installation readiness to support our forces. We discovered this in the Army. The biggest challenge we faced was, for example, I think as you and I spoke, was desertification out west at many of our bases. So it is something I'm aware of. I know we have faced a challenge in Norfolk with rising tides. It's something we have to plan on and make sure we can address it so we maintain a strong installational base.
Is it affecting our readiness?
I don't think it's affecting our readiness right now. I'd have to dig into that and get back to you to give you a more sound answer, but it's not been reported to me that it's affecting our readiness presently.
Do you agree that we need to make investments today in order to mitigate the risks that we do face and that we will face in the short, medium, and the long terms? And what would some of those investments be?
Sure. No, I think we do, where it's appropriate and where we can make a difference. And so I mentioned Norfolk. I believe is concerned about, again, rising tide, what it may do to the dry docks, and I think the Navy is investing in that. But again, that's something I'd like to come back to you on. But we are looking at those issues and tracking them and making appropriate investments.
Well, will you commit to working with me and my colleagues, the Department of Work, to determine the appropriate investments necessary to protect our national security from climate change?
Sure.
Thank you. On another topic, on cyber security, Secretary Esper, over the last year, I've had the privilege to serve on the Cyber Solarium Commission and work with your colleagues, Deputy Secretary of Defense David Norquist and Assistant Secretary Ken Rapuano. I appreciate their contributions to the discussion and the work product in the coming weeks. The Commission is going to outline a strategy of layered deterrence to protect the nation from the many threats that we face from cyberspace. Secretary, will you commit to working with me and Congressman Gallagher, who is one of the co-chairs of the Solarium Commission, and also Senator King and the members of the Commission, and also the members of this committee, to implement the many legislative recommendations outlined in the forthcoming Commission report, where we can find agreement and where practicable?
Yes, Congressman, I do. I look forward to working with you on it. I've gotten positive feedback from well with regard to that effort, so thank you for your contributions.
Thank you. In our discussion the other day when we had the opportunity to talk by phone, I expressed my concern also about the rebalance potential of forces in AFRICOM and I want to just express my concern there that leaving power vacuums will not go obviously unfilled. Our enemies and adversaries, China, Russia, are going to look to fill those areas, and I would ask you to work with the committee before any decisions are made so that we understand the costs and benefits of that rebalancing in Africa should it occur.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to begin by acknowledging that there is probably nobody in this room who's more disappointed than you that there are funds being taken from the Department of Defense to secure our border. Securing our border obviously is an issue of our national defense, but it is Congress's failure to act, not your actions, that are resulting in dollars being taken from the Department of Defense budget. It is our congressional law that allows the President to take these funds to secure our border, which has already been upheld by the Supreme Court. Congress's failure to act is the failure to actually provide the funds necessary to secure our border. We all know you don't have too much money. You have other resources and other responsibilities you'd like to apply those funds to. So I certainly hope that as people, although we're fond to criticize you for this, realize this is a criticism that should be directed toward Congress and that we should take an action to backfill those funds and give the President the funds necessary to secure our border. Mr. Secretary, I want to congratulate you on your comments at Munich and your focus with respect to China. I spoke at events with the Atlantic Council, the Potsdam Foundation, Hudson Institute, and the German Marshall Fund. I want you to know your comments resonated, both with our German counterparts, our U.S. counterparts, and also with our NATO allies. And specifically with respect to Huawei, I think your comments made a tremendous difference, and I appreciate both of you participating and speaking out. I also want to thank you for having attended Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and going and touring NASIC. It made a tremendous difference to the more than 3,000 people that you know contribute directly to our intelligence every day. And I want to raise an issue with respect to NASIC. Two questions for you, one with respect to Space Force and NASIC, and the second with respect to our nuclear enterprise. In standing up Space Force, you've said that it is our intention to advance our space capabilities and our defense of our assets and looking at that as a warfighting domain. You've indicated that you do not want duplication of services, but obviously, as you know, there are a number of people who are concerned as Space Force has stepped up, not that it would, that they might go to Space Force, but their job might, and that they might not instead. So anything that you could say in protection of our centers of excellence, that they are not at risk as you're looking at standing up Space Force and you want to actually augment and support those would be helpful. And with respect to nuclear modernization, I want to thank you for David Norquist's work and your support for the NNSA. And if you could speak for a moment, because we're going to have to debate those funds, about what Russia is doing and how it is a threat to us, because they're not just modernizing their nuclear weapons, they're creating new ones. And what does that mean as we debate our budget? Mr. Secretary.
Sure. Just quickly, I just want to say thank you for hosting me at Wright-Pat, and I did have a great visit to NASIC. They do exceptional work, and as we look forward to how we organize Space Force, obviously you're not looking for duplication, and I don't want to break something that's working. So you and I talked about that before. I'll take it back and make sure that works into all the calculations and make sure we consult with you as things evolve. But they do great work there, and thank you for showing that to me. With regard to Russia, you're absolutely correct, Congressman. What they're doing is not just growing their strategic forces, but they're creating new capabilities, and they are improving the quality of their force as well. We talk a lot about their strategic systems. What often goes is ignored are their tactical nuclear weapons. Well, I call them the unaccountable nuclear weapons. They number nearly 2,000, and then they are battlefield weapons. We see them used in naval warfare, and that's one thing we have to pay close attention to as well with regard to their strategic forces.
So as we take a look at this budget, I mean, we're obviously going to have to look at what NNSA needs so we can modernize our forces. Now, we're only modernizing, meaning we're trying to keep the capabilities that we have, not even reach their hypersonic capabilities, their violations of the INF. And could you give us your concerns about our current nuclear enterprise and the need for those funds that are in the President's budget?
Well, the current nuclear enterprise is very old, both in terms of the platforms, which is why we're modernizing all legs of the triad, but also the packages, if you will, the devices themselves. So it's important that we get to that 80 pit per year by 2030 goal so that we have what's essential, a safe, reliable, effective, credible, secure nuclear force that can keep us safe and secure in the 2030s and well beyond. And that's going to be critical. We're not trying to get into an arms race with Russia because we're not trying to match them weapon for weapon. But what we do need to have is the essentials to keep America safe and secure, to have that the different capabilities that each leg of the triad brings us with either complementary or other purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield my time to Representative Horn of Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Esper and General Milley for being here today. I'd like to turn our attention to a different issue. It's a component of our readiness that we've been doing a lot of work on over the last year that is critical, and that is our military housing. As you are both undoubtedly aware, we have had some significant issues with our privatized military housing programs. And we undertook in last year's defense authorization bill, the Tenants' Bill of Rights, and a number of other things to help address that. In the FY 2021 budget request, it contains $54.6 million for the military housing privatization initiative, which is an 82% increase from FY 2020. We know that caring for our service members and their families and ensuring that they have safe, livable housing is a critical component of our readiness. And as I understand it, this department requests for these funds are to help augment staff, improve quality control measures, develop and manage a database, and much more. We are, I think, just at the beginning. And yesterday, you signed a document that would guarantee the implementation of most of the provisions in the Tenants' Bill of Rights by May 1st. But there are a few outstanding issues I'd like to get some insight on. There are three, I think, of the most critical that will not be implemented by the 1st, and that they are the maintenance history of the housing unit, dispute resolution process, and a withholding of rent. Because at Tinker Air Force Base, right in the heart of Oklahoma, we have not seen tangible improvements in many areas that we would like to due to contractors and responsiveness. So I'd like to hear from you, since we've implemented the Tenants' Bill of Rights in the beginning, the timeline for implementing those and making sure that the funds are going directly to address these critical issues.
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. I understand the issues at Tinker are fairly acute. You know, I was at Fort Sill last year and walked through a number of homes. It has its own separate set of issues that the chairman and I worked on previously. You're right. Last night, the service secretaries and I yesterday signed out the Tenant Bill of Rights, addressing 15 of the 18 rights that were set forth in law. Those 15 were ones we were working on contemporaneously. The three that we are going to require more assistance on are dispute resolution, maintenance history, and withholding of rent provisions. In these cases, they are the reason why we can't act unilaterally is because there are legal contracts between DOD and the MHPI companies with regard to that. We have a pathway on some of these to move forward to find a mutually agreeable way to meet the intent, the spirit, if not the letter of the law. But I think we're going to have to come back and work with you all as well to assist us, because these are, again, we have legal contracts between them, and we want to make sure we, what I don't want to do is promise a right that I can't deliver on. The important thing is we have a deliverable right that service members can act on, because they should live in quality, safe housing. What we've seen in the past is completely unsatisfactory.
And Secretary, what I would ask of you and General Milley, that we have continued work to do on this issue. I think there is more that we need to do. So wherever you're running into roadblocks, we've got to fix this problem that's affecting the health and well-being of our service members and their families. General Milley, I want to turn to you for just a moment. The Army initiated a policy of having someone in uniform visiting every soldier's on-base housing unit so they could actually put eyes on the problem. We discovered that part of the challenge was a lack of oversight from our chain of command. And I'm wondering about when we can expect the other service branches to begin to implement this sort of policy.
Yeah, I will come back to you with an actual date, but we've discussed that amongst the Joint Chiefs, and each of the respective chiefs of not only just the Army, but the CNO, Chief Staff of the Air Force, Commandant Marine Corps, they've all committed to doing that. I trust they are doing that, but I can get back to you with specific dates on when it'll be complete.
Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for your attendance and for your service to our country. Ms. Secretary, in last year's NDAA, we passed language that was explicit in directing you to, quote, assign the director of the Missile Defense Agency with the principal responsibility for the development and deployment of hypersonic and ballistic tracking space sensors. That money was put in to fund that, but yet the money was redirected to the Space Development Agency. This year's funding request, you say, quote, funding responsibility has transferred from MDA to SDA for the continued hypersonic ballistic tracking space sensor development efforts. Why? Why is that not being left in MDA where we directed it to be conducted?
Yep. Mr. Rogers, my understanding is it is at MDA. If there's something misstated in our budget documents, I need to get back to you. But my understanding is it resides with MDA. It's the hypersonic and ballistic missile tracking space sensor payload, as you discussed. They both are obviously closely coordinating on that. But MDA did receive the funding for both those things, and it's 2-year funds. So
I'd ask you to revisit that because that funding was redirected to SDA, and nothing has been done on the last year on that issue, which you know is a very important threat for us.
Right. And, you know, I've been down to the arsenal, and I've walked through those programs in the past. But let me get back to you because I'm getting a different readout from my folks, and we can reconcile that.
Thank you. You've made it clear that you're fully committed to a 355-ship Navy. And in order to get that, we're going to have to buy smaller ships that can be deployed faster. You've also said you see those being lightly manned ships. Do you think those are going to be medium or large unmanned vessels, or do you think you're going to have to get some smaller ships into the fleet mix?
Yeah, the first thing, I am committed to a 355-ship Navy, but I got to say, I actually think we need more than 355 ships. And to get there, I think what the composition needs to change, fewer large platforms, more smaller platforms. We need to have lightly manned, moving to eventually optionally manned. And I think we need more attack submarines, frankly. They have to have certain compositional characteristics. They got to have distributed awareness and lethality, survivability. They have to be sustainable over the long run. They have the ability to deliver lethal fire. So I think what we need to do is be much more aggressive in terms of experimenting and prototyping, and then quickly move to production once we feel confident. But we need to maintain the U.S. Navy as the greatest force in the world, and we need to adapt to the threats we see. The two challenges we have right now is we need to base it off of a current op plan, which we don't have, and secondly, we need to update it based on a new joint warfighting doctrine, something that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is working on. I think that will really help inform so we're prepared to deal with the challenges that we see in the 2030s, 40s, and 50s.
Great. You've also emphasized the need for a healthy industrial base, including shipyards. How do you plan to incorporate these shipyards into our industrial base?
They are absolutely critical, not just the yards, but I assume when you say yards, it's the workers as well. I've talked to several members about how do we certify, how do we give predictability in funding, how do we do those things. I think we probably need more yards to do the work to build a much, much larger Navy, and I think it's something we really have to focus on. GAO did an extensive report in December which outlined all the challenges the Navy is facing with regard to maintenance, and so much of it is based on both capacity at the yards and the training of the workforce.
Great. General Milley, the Indo-Pacific region is getting a lot of attention for good reason given what China, Russia, and North Korea are up to. There's been some discussions about increasing the duration of rotations of the Army Specific Pathways Program. Is that something you're planning to do across the services or just the Army?
No, that's across the services in terms of increasing rotations throughout Indo-Pacific. Again, in the NDS, a strategy-driven budget here, in the NDS, the Indo-Pacific was designated as the, quote, in the military terms, the main effort. That doesn't mean it's the only effort, but it's the main effort. So the preponderance of U.S. military capability in various forms, either forward-based and stationed and or cyclically rotating through for exercises and or deployments, is what we're trying to do. So it applies to all the services, not just the Army.
Okay, I've yielded the balance of my time to Ms. Cheney if she has a question.
I just want to echo the concerns and the comments that you've heard about the reprogramming. I also want to know whether or not the department has decided that contrary to what we heard repeatedly from your predecessors, an increase of 3 to 5% real growth annually is necessary in order to maintain and continue the kind of growth that we've seen in rebuilding the budget. That's not what we've seen, and if we're being forced to choose between modernizing our nuclear forces and building Virginia-class submarines, then you're not asking for enough money, and we're not providing you with the kind of regularity that you need.
The department needs
The
department needs 3 to 5% real growth annually if we're going to fully implement the National Defense Strategy.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the spirit of Carl Vinson, I want to just talk to the two witnesses today about the 19% cut to shipbuilding in this year's budget. A couple days ago, the Congressional Research Service looked at the department's submission of the budget. Mr. O'Rourke, who knows more about shipbuilding than anybody in this town combined, actually, in his understated way, eviscerated this request. In the department's submission this morning, it states that there are 8 ships, new ships, that are in their budget plan. Mr. O'Rourke actually determined that the LPD 31, which was listed, actually we funded and authorized last year. So there's actually only 7. 2 of those 7 are tugboats. They are salvage ships. We are not getting briefings in this committee about Russian tugboats or Chinese tugboats. We, in fact, then are left with really 5 combatant ships. Mr. Secretary, I've been on the Sea Power Committee for 14 years. You have to go back to the height of the surge, when the Navy shipbuilding was a bill payer, because we had 200,000 troops in a land war over in the Middle East, to see such an anemic shipbuilding request from the administration here today. And I would just say this is a punch in the gut to shipyard workers, the metal trades who are making life commitments to learn how to be welders and electricians and carpenters, to see this radical rudder turn in this year's budget in terms of shipbuilding. It is also a punch in the gut to the supply chain, who, again, we have been coaxing back into shipbuilding, again, after the lean years during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, to make investments in terms of capital and hiring. Again, they're going to be on the Hill next Monday, making the rounds here. BWXT from Ohio issued an earnings warning yesterday. They are the sole supplier of nuclear reactors for Navy ships because of that cut to the Virginia-class program. But lastly, it is a punch in the gut to the combatant commanders. Again, just in the last few days, we've had General Walters at European Command talk about a 50% increase in Russian submarine patrol operations. We've had Woody Lewis from the U.S. Second Fleet talking about the ever-increasing number of submarines. Admiral Davidson over in Indo-Pacific saying that his day-to-day submarine requirement is met by slightly only 50% of what I've asked for. So again, this budget fails the test in terms of a national defense strategy, which is focused on our near-peer competitors, because it is primarily an air and sea challenge when you're talking about Russia and China. And again, you don't recover from a cut like this anytime soon. Again, just for the record, we are 52 attack submarines today, with the retirement of Los Angeles-class submarines, which are going to accelerate over the next 4 or 5 years. That fleet is going to shrink to 44 subs. Your budget keeps us in that trough into the 2030s. And again, it just defies any analysis in terms of something that comports with a national defense strategy, again, based on the activities that we are seeing from China and Russia. Thank goodness that Admiral Gilday, in his unfunded budget priorities, number 1 on his list, which he submitted a couple days ago, is to restore that Virginia-class submarine so that we at least get out of this trough, which we are going to still be contending with throughout the 2020s, and we can get closer to the goal of a 355-ship Navy. And again, Mr. O'Rourke's report, which I would ask to be admitted to the record,
with no hearing, no
makes it crystal clear that projecting out over the next 5 years, it is a cut from the Obama projection in terms of fleet size, and also keeps us further away from trying to get to the goal of the 350-ship Navy. Mr. Secretary.
Can I respond?
No, let me ask a question now, okay? Article 10, Section 231 of the U.S. Code says that when a budget comes over from the Department of Defense, it shall be accompanied by a 30-year shipbuilding plan. This is not sort of a feel-good law. It's because Congress needs headlights to see where you're going because of the fact that shipbuilding is such a long game. And again, it's not like helicopters or planes. When you cut, You don't get it back. Time is of the essence. Mr. Whitman and I sent a letter to your department on February 12th, asking for the 30-year shipbuilding plan, which again did not accompany the budget, and we have still not seen that 30-year shipbuilding plan today. When are we going to get that 30-year shipbuilding plan, which again is mandated by law?
I think I'm going to need more time, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You may have to take that for the record.
No,
Go ahead, take a shot.
It's a very
Go
good
ahead.
discussion. It's a very important discussion. So, Mr. Courtney, I haven't seen the 30-year shipbuilding plan. I'm awaiting its presentation to me. It's my report. Once I've had a chance to review it and digest it and follow up on it, at the appropriate point in time, I will share with you what I believe our future force structure should look like. With regard to the first point you made, I will say this much. I think it's a very important issue. I'm a big believer in attack submarines. I actually believe, my gut tells me we need more than what we've planned for, number one. But there are two competing pressures we have right now. A top-line budget, which actually gives us 2% less buying power. But the second thing, and importantly, is I support what the Navy did in terms of moving $4 billion, nearly $4 billion, from shipbuilding to maintenance. The concern that the CNO has, that the acting secretary has, that I have, is that we have a hollow Navy. Why do I know that? GAO report dated December of last year said this much. Over the last 5 years, 75% of our surface ships never left maintenance on time. Of that 75%, half of those ships took over 3 months to get to sea. And what does that account for? That means...
And I know this is really important, but the other members are going to kill me.
Okay, but one just last point. What that equates to is 19 ships in 2019 unavailable to go to sea. We cannot have a hollow Navy. I agree we need to build a 355-plus ship Navy, but we can't have a hollow Navy at the same time.
Thank you. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Esper and General Milley, thank you both for your service. I realize we're in open session and much of the information on military space is classified, but I think it's necessary for us to talk in general terms about the threats to our space systems. We've enjoyed a distinct advantage for decades, but now that's being severely tested and challenged. So what actions have you taken to address this threat to our military space, our national security space assets in this budget?
I'm sorry, it's a great issue. It's so much we cannot talk about in open session. But needless to say, we are advancing our capabilities in a number of different areas to make sure that we can fight in space, which has now become a warfighting domain. Obviously, we stood up Space Force. We've stood up Space Command. That'll give us enhanced authorities and control. We've requested additional authorities, which the President has granted. And so we are doing our very best and putting a lot of resources into this to make sure that we can continue to guarantee our space capabilities and what we need from space.
Are you confident that the assets we are investing in this budget will stay ahead of and will meet the threat?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good. That's good to hear. Then let me shift attention to missile defense funding. Secretary Rood and General O'Shaughnessy have both said that while our current GMD, ground-based mid-course defense posture can be relied upon to counter a North Korean threat for the next 5 or 6 years, beyond that, we have to begin assuming increased risk due to their desire to develop their ICBM capabilities. Earlier this month, General O'Shaughnessy said before SASC, given the nature of the ballistic missile threat, I am a strong advocate for bringing a layered capability on board for the warfighter well before NGI, Next Generation Interceptor, is fielded. And Secretary Rood agreed. So are you in support of an SM-32A underlay or some kind of interim GMD solution to bridge this gap until NGI comes online in a decade or so?
Well, I think it's a matter of principle. We should always have a layered defense. I know the department is looking at those systems to include enhanced THAAD as a way to provide a layered defense. But in all circumstances, you typically want a layered defense.
So testing the SM-32A would be one way to begin establishing that underlayer?
SM-32A is a system that you'd have to continue testing to make sure we can do that. I have a recusal with regard to the company that makes that system or parts of it, so I don't want to say too much. It is an established program nonetheless.
Okay, sure. Now, on the budget itself, the dollars you're asking for missile defense, when you subtract things out that historically have not been in the missile defense budget, like Air Force OPIR, you come up with a number that's about $14 billion. And the way I look at it, that's half $500 million less than last year's budget. How can we keep pace with the emerging threats if we're cutting that budget?
Well, Congressman, when I look at missile defense and defeat, our numbers, we see actually a 5% increase. Important to that is a OPR layer in LEO. That'll give us critical tracking capabilities, sustainability, particularly with regard to enemy hypersonic weapons. It's a growth area where we really need to invest more with regard to that LEO OPIR.
Okay, thank you for that. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service, but apparently you're not listening. You apparently were not listening to what the chairman and the ranking member said about the authority of this committee with regard to appropriations. I urge you to very carefully consider what has been said thus far with regard to the ripoff and with regard to the disregard that this administration has for the Constitution and the appropriation power of Congress. Secondly, in your response to Mr. Courtney, you were out of line, sir. The law is quite clear. When you submit your budget, you are to submit the shipbuilding plan. And for you to say you're going to give it to us on your own good time and when you're ready, you are not in line with the law. I'll let it go with that. You should listen very carefully. You are heading for a major brawl with this committee. Now, my question goes to you, Chairman Milley. The U.S. government's current approach to strategic Sealift has yielded an aging and inactive government fleet that depends on a shrinking pool of merchant mariners and ships that have trouble getting underway. I'm concerned that a resilient maritime logistics strategy doesn't exist, and that in your job as chairman, it seems to me that you're responsible for coordinating all of the necessary elements to achieve a resilient maritime logistics program. How are you going to achieve that?
Thanks, Congressman. I would even expand it beyond just the maritime. So the issue is for the United States to project power overseas at points of crisis, time of need sort of thing, and to do it in a timely way. Get there firstest with the mostest sort of thing. And we do that fundamentally through Sealift and airlift. And in both those areas, our strategic ability to do that has been under stress. It's deteriorated over not just last year or the year before, but many, many years. And you're right to point out the vulnerability of the maritime fleet and our reliance on other means to try to do this. We can handle the smaller contingencies, no problem. But if you start seriously considering great power competition, great power war, when you start seriously considering the NDS, well, those requirements then, and I think you heard the TRANSCOM commander talk the other day or testify perhaps recently, then it becomes very much a stress. So what are we doing about it? There's lots of studies and analysis and so on and so forth. That's important, and we have to try to figure out exactly what the facts are. But it's all about investment, it's all about these budgets, and it's all about looking at tip fids and also concepts of the operation and O plans as to how we're going to have to modify with the deck of cards we're dealt. We're not going to magically create a new maritime fleet this year or next year, and yet something could happen. So how are we going to have to deal with that? And we have a review ongoing right now amongst the Joint Chiefs of all the global combatant commanders' plans, war plans, and I am the global integrator, as you rightly point out, and we're working through all that. It's a very, very difficult situation, and it is a vulnerability that we have. We recognize that we have it, and we're going to try to get it fixed.
Thank you, sir. That does take us back to what I just brought up with Secretary Esper, in that his shipbuilding plan doesn't speak to this issue at all. There are ways of doing it. There's an interesting report out there called Sustaining the Fight. It talks about the development of a national fleet, which is really the rebuilding of our maritime sector, the private commercial sector in such a way that it is useful to the Navy for Sealift capacity. To draw your attention to that, look forward to working with you on this set of issues. And finally, Mr. Secretary, obey the law and recognize you're in for a major brawl with at least a good section of this committee as the President continues to rip off what were apparently necessary funds. You also indicated in your response on climate change that it is not affecting the Navy or not affecting the military. Perhaps I heard you wrong. You might look at Tyndall, you might look at Offutt, you might look at Norfolk, you might look across the entire spectrum of the military and recognize that there is a severe impact already as a result of climate change. It's going to get worse, and I urge you to pay attention to the current NDAA that requires you, as Secretary, to pay attention to this issue in every single part of the military. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Garamendi, I am paying attention. As I said very clearly to Mr. Langevin, I do recognize the impact on the military. In fact, I mentioned Norfolk in particular, and I mentioned the impact of desertification on Army bases.
Yeah, and where is it in the budget?
The gentleman's time has expired. I get the feeling this could go on for a while, so I've got to get to Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper, General Milley, thank you so much for joining us. Secretary Esper, I wanted to ask you specifically about Sealift. You heard a little bit of the question, but I want to go to September 17th when there was a turbo activation of our surge Sealift capacity, essentially trying to exercise what would be a full-scale operational exercise if the call went out that day. Our readiness goal there is 85% availability is what we're supposed to have. Unfortunately, under that exercise, we saw that our availability was at about 40%. We know we have an aging ready reserve fleet, on average 45 years old. Those ships are older than a number of members on this committee. So we are really pushing the envelope with that. The question not only becomes, what do we need to do to reestablish that? I think that some of that's laid out, although I think more needs to be done. But one of the important elements is, how do we pay for that? You stated that of the strategic necessities for our nation, the B-21 was the responsibility of the Air Force. The Columbia class was the responsibility of the Navy. Since surge Sealift capacity is the ability for the Army to get to the fight, should it not be the Army's responsibility to fund surge Sealift capacity?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you on the Sealift issue. I've been concerned about it for a few years now. General Lyons and I have had multiple conversations. As you know, 90% of the Army goes by sea, which is why once I get the 30-year shipbuilding report and I have a chance to go through it, I want to make sure Sealift is in there because we have to have that capacity. And it's a combination of new ships, old ships, and other means to do that. So it is vitally important. I have, with regard to your specific question, I have not looked at that with regard to who should pay that. It's traditionally been a Navy bill. Mm-hmm. Each of the services pays bills that they argue should not be theirs. The Air Force, for example, doesn't like the pass-through with regard to a lot of black programs. Army has concerns on its front. So I think at the end of the day, what we have to do is find a solution going forward so that we can fund the Navy we need, and that includes not just surface combatants, but that includes the strategic Sealift.
Yeah, I think the logistical element of supporting forces, sustaining forces is going to be key, especially in that strategic environment where all our adversaries have to do is to look at it and go, listen, they can't sustain operations, they can't protect tankers, all those things incredibly important to those O plans that General Milley spoke about. Let me take another step further, too. You've heard some conversations about the 355-ship Navy. I think it's got to be there, and as you spoke of, maybe even higher as we look at all the different platforms. The key is, though, this year's budget. I mean, this year's budget request, as Mr. Courtney pointed out, 8 ships, 2 of those tugboats, and then we're decommissioning 4 LCSs, 4 cruisers, and 3 amphibious ships. So, I mean, I'm not very good at math, but that math doesn't add up to me to get to 355. In fact, we're heading south on that. So tell me, as we see our near-peer adversary, China, bring on board a brand new destroyer, a very capable ship, the Shandong class of aircraft carriers, is that really the direction that we need to be going? And is the budget reflective of what this nation needs to project power and to deter conflict?
We need to get on a better trajectory for 355 plus for sure. That's why, as I said earlier, we need that 3 to 5% annual real growth to help do that. I do support, though, the Navy's decision to reallocate dollars, if you will, to readiness because of the challenge they have with getting ships to sea and operationally available. I also understand the reason. In many cases, they're putting more money into maintenance for ships than what it would cost to fund them going forward. So, look, they're in a tough situation. I want to help the Navy as much as possible. Acting Secretary Milley's made I think, a good call to dig deep within his own budget. I mean, you know, about 10 or 11% of the entire Navy budget is only dedicated to shipbuilding. Right. And I think he's going to dig deep to try and find additional funding to do what he needs to do. And then what we'd like to do also, I think I mentioned this to you, is have a legislative provision come forward where DOD would seek authority to transfer any expired Navy funds, which otherwise would go to the Treasury, and have them plowed back into SCN. We think that could generate at least $1 billion a year or so that we could plunge back into shipbuilding. And that's something that other departments of the federal government already have available to them.
I agree. I think it's incredibly important to have flexibility in the SCN account, especially since the demand's going up. Dollars are either level or going down. Things like National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund. I understand the whole debate back and forth about the strategic assets in this nation's arsenal. But I think that discussion needs to be had because we did do Ohio-class that way, and when you put a $6 billion ship into that shipbuilding budget, it makes the seas pretty tough.
Time has expired. Mr. Norcross.
Thank you. General Milley, Secretary Esper, thank you for coming in today. I want to shift my first question away from some of the things we've been talking about, but very much involved. Making sure warfighters get the best available to them comes from a number of areas. Our industrial base, who supports them, and then our human capital, the employees, Department of Defense. Secretary Esper, on January 29th, President Trump authorized you to eliminate collective bargaining in the DOD and to delegate that authority to any Senate-confirmed official in the department. The President cited perceived threats to national security and the department's flexibility to adapt to new technologies as justification for this. DOD civilian workforce are some of the greatest employees in the world. We know what they do day in and day out. Ultimately, our national security is bolstered by those employees. We talked about that. Do you plan on exercising this authority to provide the President to exclude the defense civilians?
Well, first of all, Congressman, we do have a great DOD civilian workforce. In my multiple iterations to Pentagon, I've had the chance to work with them. I am one of them. And it is a great workforce. We rely on them for the continuity and expertise that are critical to sustaining our military. You're right, that executive order was issued late January. It's working its way through the system right now. It has not come to me with any recommendations or analysis, and I know that's in the process, and that's all I have for you right now on it.
Did you request that or somebody on your behalf from the
No, I did not request that.
Do you have any idea why that came up?
I don't.
Can you point to a time in our recent history where that might be employed? Because I was going back through labor history, I didn't see any issues. I've never heard of it from anybody. But the folks that you want to be part of your team could be potentially eliminated because of this order that apparently came out of nowhere. And if you can't think of a reason why it might have been done in the past, and I don't know of any, how's this showing up?
Well, just because I can't recall an issue right now doesn't mean one doesn't exist. That's why I think the prudent thing for me is to wait to see what the analysis is, comes up from my staff, and what they're looking at, and make an assessment from there based on whatever recommendations are made.
So when you get that report, we would love to have that shared with us. The idea of creating potential havoc when we work well together, it just seems rather crazy. I only have a few minutes, but I just want to bring up something that has been alluded to. We have early retirements for the 13 KC-135s and 16 of the KC-10s. It's about 40 years ago that General McDougall said in this very room, what keeps him up at night are the refuelers. We know the issues with the KC-46. There appears to be a gap that is growing here. Boeing I believe you're very close to having the fix on both the boom and the visual system. But regardless of what the fix is, it's going to be a period of 3 years possibly. Why would we be retiring more refuelers when we're building up the capacity to need those?
Yeah, it's a great issue. It's one of these issues, it's not sexy, right? It's like strategic Sealift, but it's utterly important. I was on a 46 last week. I actually sat in the front end of the airplane where the issues with the remote vision system and talked through all the issues. And the head of Air Force acquisition thinks that a solution is in sight, but it will take some time. At the same time, I had this exact discussion about, well, what does that do to a growing gap, right? And I think General Lyons is going to come to me, probably the chairman, and make some recommendations as to maybe we should not retire some 10s or some 135s until we get a better assessment of how long it will take to get that fix in place. And I look forward to hearing from him on it because it is critical that we maintain that, that capability. This kind of also gets back into the reason why I'm doing COCOM reviews. We have COCOMs all the time. They're using tankers for various missions, and if they are missions that are not important or not on a high priority, I can close, in addition to increasing supply, I can reduce the demand.
Are you considering contracting tanker support from private industry?
I think all the options, I would like to rely on General Lyons to bring me a range of options that we can entertain and figure out what's the best way so that we don't have a gap that seriously impacts our national security. I don't know, Chairman, if you want.
Thank you, Mr. Arcos. Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate your service. Clearly, we're at a great power competition with China, and we are assessing the threats. The National Defense Strategy lays out a lot of the concerns and strategies, but a vulnerability that we have is in our pharmaceutical industry. As we know, our national supply of antibiotics and vaccines and many other drugs depends on Chinese manufacturers. In fact, Chinese pharmaceutical producers provide 97% of our U.S. antibiotic market. So, General Milley, could you expound a little bit more on the vulnerability to our military as it relates to our dependence on Chinese for our pharmaceuticals?
Well, as you well know, we've got a military medical system, and we have access to all the same drugs that are available in the commercial system, et cetera. And you rightly point out that it's a vulnerability to have a country such as China manufacturing high percentages. I don't know if it's 97% or 98% or 80% or whatever it is, but I do know it's high percentages of the ingredients to the American pharmaceutical industry across the country, both military and civilian. So it is a vulnerability. If in time of armed conflict, if that were to ever happen, and hopefully that would never happen, that would obviously be a significant vulnerability to the U.S. So it is something we need to address. We need to address it as a nation. There's vulnerabilities imposed on us as a military, but also as a society.
That's great. I appreciate that. Representative Garamendi and I have a bill that would ask the DOD to look further into this threat and to pursue standing up American pharmaceuticals in order to make that supply available for our military. So look forward to working with you on that. Secretary Esper, I wanted to talk about in 2019, Congress authorized the Defense Community Infrastructure Program, which to address deficiencies in community infrastructure that will enhance the military value and resilience, quality of life for military installation. And in the fiscal year 2020, Congress appropriated $50 million for this program that's to be managed and executed by the Office of Economic Adjustment. Yet to date, the department has yet to release guidelines or details about the process by which communities will be able to propose projects and compete for funding under this program. And I have communities in my district that are very excited about this program, and they're ready to apply. They just need that information, that guidance. So can you share a little update on when they can expect that guidance, and are you committed to this program?
Sure. Well, thank you for raising it, Congresswoman. I actually received several letters that I've reviewed recently, and I asked the team, what is this, what's going on? So I got a quick briefing on it. My understanding is they're going to be delivering recommendations with regard to implementation here in the coming weeks, a month or so, and then from there we can move forward in terms of implementing the law and expending the appropriations as.
Good. That's great. We also have challenges in our country right now with respect to the munition capability and capacity. As you know, our stockpiles of our high demand preferred and precision guided munitions have been significantly reduced over the last 15 years. We've been trying to address this, but I was wondering, Secretary Esper as well as General Milley, if you could talk a little bit about your assessment of where we stand right now with our precision guided and preferred munitions as far as the risk that we're facing right now, and what steps are you taking to adjust and counter this risk?
Another important issue that doesn't get much attention, it's something I get updated on regularly with regard to a status of munitions, particularly key munitions. There are some areas we need to continue to put a lot of money into. We did in this budget cycle. I've also messaged to many of our allies and partners that they need to procure their own key munitions. In many cases, they're depending on us, and I just told them that's not going to be available for them. So I think it's something we've got to focus on and continue to put money against. It's again, it's not sexy, but it's critically important we have availability of these assets and for an extended period of time, because in some cases, if you get in a shooting match, you just can't produce the munitions quick enough.
Exactly, and there's supply chain issues as well. What has been the reaction of your allies? As you have said, you need to step up.
I think this is one of these cases that for too long we haven't told them the truth with regard to what their expectations should be. And it's, by the way, for them to do that would not only make them more whole and take the burden off of us, it would also help our own industries remain healthy and be able to reinvest and recapitalize. So I think this is a message I've discussed with many of our allies about the need to procure their own precision munitions and other items.
Great. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, if the President were to declare a national emergency over climate change, would he be able to reprogram money from DOD to respond to that emergency using existing transfer authority?
I don't know, Congressman.
You don't know, okay. Would there be a limit how much money the President could reprogram to have the Pentagon pay for that declared national emergency?
I just don't know. It's speculative, and I'm not a lawyer, so.
Well, you are the Secretary of Defense, and they just reprogrammed a lot of money away from us. Do you have an opinion on that?
I know that is legally available to us because the DOD lawyers and the White House lawyers and the Department of Homeland Security lawyers have advised me that it is legally available.
It's legally available because the President has declared that the border is an emergency. So therefore, if we have any other President declaring something random an emergency, don't you think the same authorization would be legal at that point?
Well, again, I'm not going to speculate.
Okay. So there, in that case, then also you wouldn't be able to speculate what accounts would be available to be reprogrammed. So is it ships, troop pay, military construction? All that should be fair game according to the ideology this President is using in terms of reprogramming.
I'm not going to speculate.
General Milley, let me get your advice then. Does the recent reprogramming notification that we receive, taking money away from what you have previously briefed us as critical department needs, does that constitute a threat to the defense of the nation now that we have reprogrammed that money?
I was, in this particular case, I was asked to conduct a formal assessment. I did that, submitted it to the Secretary of Defense in writing. And in short, what I said was that this reprogramming of $3.8 billion was not a significant, immediate, strategic, negative impact to the overall defense of the United States of America. Those were precisely selected words. So strategic and overall. It's 0.5% of the overall budget. So I can't in conscience say that it's, significant, it's immediate, it's going to, the sky is falling, it's going to be a dramatic decrement in the preparedness of the U.S. military to defend ourselves. We can defend the United States of America. So I had to do a risk assessment. I did that, and that's what I said.
Thank you. Thank you, General. Let's move on to the Army 5th Corps headquarters in Europe. And I'll start with Secretary Esper. I was really pleased to actually see that we're reactivating the 5th Corps. And I understand it's focused on our interests and national security in Europe. And I think we all here applaud that, without a doubt. But my question is, if 5th Corps is European-focused, why was the decision made for it to be based in Fort Knox?
I'd have to refer you to the Army for that answer, Mr. Gallego. I don't know why they chose Fort Knox as the basing location.
Okay. Generally, I don't know if you have any insight into this.
Yeah, I mean, it's an Army, in the rule sets that we operate by, basing decisions are service secretary decisions. But having said that, just, a short while ago, I've been the Chief of Staff of the Army. It was discussed that it's been out there for quite a while, the entire decision-making process. The bottom line is, do you want a forward-based permanent force, or do you want to rotate it through? And what's the needs of the combatant commander? And the consensus, the decisions were made with with then Scaparrotti, now Walters, fully involved in the decision-making, that it's best to have a CONUS base, continental U.S. base, and rotate forward a small forward command post that can then move around to various countries within Europe, rather than be tied to a given base and have a big structure put in Europe. So that was the logic behind it, and that's why we decided to base it in the United States, and the Army decided Fort Knox.
Was there a General? Thank you for that answer. Was there a cost-benefit analysis between having it in Europe or other places in Europe and here at CONUS?
Cost-benefit analysis, I would say yes. I'd have to check with Secretary McCarthy for a final analysis on that, but I would say yes, because cost-benefit analysis is part of the process of basing decisions, along with environmental impact statements and all kinds of other things. There's an entire checklist of requirements you have to do a basing decision, and cost-benefit analysis is part of that.
And just to drill down a little deeper, when doing the cost-benefit analysis between Europe or European headquarters and CONUS, there was a actual analysis of European potential sites. They weren't just automatically excluded from that cost-benefit analysis.
I can't answer that specifically. Okay. But I would tell you at a broader level, and for several years, I have been an advocate within the Department of Defense on rotating forces forward and minimizing forward presence and permanent basing in foreign countries. There's reasons for that. Force protection is a key part of that, but also expense. It's very expensive to have us, U.S. military, with our families, et cetera, and DOD schools and commissaries and PXs and all that. And it's operationally, it's much more useful if the combatant commander can move forces around quickly without thinking about having to, well, I'm taking them away from their family for 2 or 3 weeks or whatever. If you deploy on a rotational basis as a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, you're much more flexible if you are operating on a rotational basis. That's why the Army went to brigades, for example, to rotate into Korea. So I'm an advocate for
the gentleman's time has expired. If you could just sum that up. Sorry, I don't want to.
Yep. Advocate for minimizing forward presence, and I'm an advocate for rotating forces forward.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper, I don't necessarily blame this on you, but would appreciate your assistance with it. We received your testimony sometime around 5 p.m. yesterday afternoon, just shortly before that. I know that you have to submit your testimony, I believe, to OPM, and then OPM has to approve it before it actually comes to committee staff. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you, with your history, understand when we receive it at 5 p.m. or thereabout, and the hearing is the next morning at 10 a.m., that has become more commonplace than not, and would appreciate your help in having those reports submitted in a more timely manner. Some of us do. I think most of us personally read them, and if not get the opportunity to personally read them, have somebody in our office point out the highlights of them.
Absolutely. I wasn't aware of that, so we do want to get it to you on time for sure.
General Milley, you mentioned the F-35 versus the A-10. My understanding is that a report was due at the end of 2019 from the Operational Test and Evaluation Office, comparison between the F-35 and the A-10 on the close air support mission. Has that report been completed?
I honestly don't know. I can give you a comparison from my own personal experience, having not called in close air support from a F-35, but on an A-10. A-10 is a great weapon system too. So when it comes to close air support, we on the ground, we really don't care where that bomb comes from as long as it shows up. And all of these weapon systems are very, very effective. The A-10 has proven extraordinarily effective in Afghanistan and Iraq. But the F-35 is your next generation. If you start looking at great power competition, it's the F-35.
Absolutely, but from a close air support mission, the F-35, depending on which variant, has
that's right.
between 182 and 220 rounds of ammunition.
Roger that.
And that is in prior National Defense Authorization Acts and appropriation measures, we have prohibited the drawing down of the A-10 until the DOD could convince this body, the legislative branch of the government, that the F-35 was capable of handling the close air support mission. And yet the one thing that is not mentioned in either of your testimonies is the fact that you have proposed to draw down 44 of the current A-10s that are in the inventory. And so that is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, decisions like that are secretaries, so I'm not going to get into secretaries, but from an advice standpoint, there's a fundamental issue at stake here, which is, and it's coming up in a lot of areas, whether it's tankers and maritime and ships and, whatever it is. It's a question of divest to invest. We are at a pivot point, in my opinion. My military assessment is we're at a pivot point relative to the changing character of war and the geopolitical landscape that's occurring in the world today. And we've got to make some fundamental choices and to lay down the markers for what that future military is going to look like 5, 10 years. And if we don't make those hard choices, then we're going to be in the short end of the stick here 10 years from now, 15 years from now. So,
if I could, General Milley, war is a decision between the bad and the worse.
That's right.
And budgets are decisions between the needs and the needs more.
Yep, that's right.
My concern with what I see from the department is sometimes we give up a weapon system that is extremely efficient to operate and extremely effective.
Yep.
In the hopes that we're going to have one that's better at some point in the future.
Right.
And in the private sector, nobody would give up the system that works until the replacement system had proven itself.
Right.
Both capable and efficient. And I know, Secretary Esper, you were about to make a statement.
Just, I know because you're short on time. Just like the Navy did with older ships, what the Air Force is trying to do is retire a number of aircraft. It's not just some A-10s, but it's tankers and B-1s and F-15s. I don't think what they're trying to do is retire older aircraft that cost more to maintain and operate than they do. So I don't think what the Air Force is doing was not a statement about the A-10.
Right.
It was a statement about just retiring a legacy aircraft.
I'm down to about 30 seconds. Yep. And I want to say this, ABMS and the J-Stars are at Robins Air Force Base.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a premature decision to cancel the recap of the J-Stars fleet. I think if you could have bought a new platform that was a better platform that would have served its purpose long into the future, cheaper than you can maintain the existing fleet of J-Stars as time goes on. I'm concerned about an article that I read. This is the article, ABMS can't be the sole solution for Joint C2, Army tells Air Force. There are 3 generals quoted in that article, General Wesley, General Gallagher, and General Bassett, I believe, quoted in that article expressing their concerns about the ABMS platform not being able to deliver for the ground troops.
Yeah,
the gentleman's time has expired. I apologize. And I think the point has been made. That'd be great. Yes.
I'm heading out to take a hard look at exactly what you're talking
about. That's an ongoing discussion.
Yep,
yes,
it is.
We'd love to get an answer. Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I could not agree more with your statement that we are at a pivot point where we have to modernize our approach to national security. Do you believe in a whole-of-government approach to national security?
110%, yes.
Secretary Mattis has said before Congress that, quote, if you don't fund the State Department fully, that I need to buy more ammunition.
That's right.
You agree with that, Secretary Esper? Do you agree with that statement?
I do. I think we need to fund the interagency, particularly in places like Africa, where the interagency brings a lot to the game.
Great, because that's actually where I'm going. To quote again from Secretary Mattis, what you have to do is you have to make certain that your foreign policy is led by the diplomats, not by the military, end quote. Do you agree with that statement?
I agree.
So, Mr. Secretary, what is the State Department's opinion on the blank slate review in Africa?
They support it. I've had a number of conversations with Secretary Pompeo with regard to the process I'm going through. My aim is to
that's illuminating, because I was just in East Africa, and literally every single military officer and State Department official I spoke to on the ground said that we should both increase State Department and DoD funding and effort for AFRICOM. But your blank slate review is not really a blank slate, because the only options on the table are reducing our commitment to AFRICOM. Isn't that correct?
That is not correct. In fact, I actually approved an increase recently for security forces at Manda Bay. So we are looking at a variety of options. The predominantly ones are to make reductions right now.
Okay, well, there's a fundamental disagreement between you and the AFRICOM commander then, because he briefed me that the only options were reducing the presence.
They are predominantly to reduce presence, but if they have a proposal to increase, I would look at anything. But it is a blank slate review, and I can't speak to what State Department is doing with regard to, how they look at the situation.
Well, the State Department people on the ground said they haven't even been asked. So you might suggest that that Secretary Pompeo actually ask his people on the ground what they think. I mean, I do know that in 2018, President Xi announced that China will be providing $60 billion in financial support to Africa. China now has surpassed the U.S. as Africa's largest trading partner. They have troops on the ground in Africa for the first time ever. So we've got a rising threat from China to meet right on the ground in Africa.
Well, this is why what I'm trying to look at is make sure we're properly positioned and right-sized to deal with great power competition. My sense is right now we're focused maybe too much on counterterrorism. So I want to get the balance right with regard to forces. On the other hand, it is not a purely military mission. It requires a whole-of-government approach. The third thing I'd say is, look, we can't play man-to-man defense with the Chinese and Russians in Africa. We have to be very thoughtful with regard to how we allocate our resources, whether it's the military, diplomats, whatever the case may be. Otherwise,
couldn't agree more.
I'll never be able to meet the demands of the imposed.
Couldn't agree more. Mr. Secretary, Republican Mac Thornberry of Texas courageously asked if Congress's military budget next year would matter, or whether you and OMB would simply reprogram money for things like the border wall that the President wants and Congress has not, in our constitutional authority, authorized. Now, you failed to answer the question. You simply said that you hope Congress and the administration will be partners. Mr. Secretary, does the word partners occur in the Constitution describing Congress and the committee's budgetary authority?
Not that I'm aware of, Congressman.
Mr. Secretary, after you were nominated to be Secretary of Defense of the greatest military in the world, I was pleased to see a smart and accomplished professional in national security, a fellow infantry officer, and someone who I have worked with personally on a number of issues, selected to succeed Secretary Mattis. And if you remember, I addressed one pointed question to you, which is this. I said, Secretary Mattis left big shoes to fill, and the single most important thing that he did in your position was he was willing to stand up to the President, to disagree with Donald Trump when he proposed doing things against the national security interests of the United States and our troops. Now, look, we all know that Trump, a draft dodger in great contrast to yourself and the chairman who have served our country for decades, has often done things that are in his own personal or political interests against the national security interests of the United States or the well-being of our troops. Mr. Secretary, have you been willing to not just disagree, but stand up to the President?
I'm not going to speak to my personal conversations with the President, but I can assure you that the President welcomes dissenting views, opposing views, because what he seeks from his advisors is a wide range of opinions that can help him make the best choices.
Mr. Secretary, when you took this job, did you take an oath to the President or to the Constitution?
Constitution of the United States. I've taken that oath multiple times over my 40 years of professional life.
It must be very difficult to reconcile having lived with the West Point Honor Code, that, quote, no cadet shall lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those that do, when working for this President. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Stefanik.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to take the moment to remind members of the rules of the committee and the rules of the House, given the questions asked by Mr. Moulton denigrating the President. But moving on, I want to focus my questions on missile defense. As both you, Secretary Esper, and you, Chairman Milley, are aware, according to the 2019 Missile Defense Review, it states that building a new GBI interceptor site in the continental United States would add interceptor capability against the potential expansion of missile threats to the homeland, including a future Iranian ICBM capability. The decision to do so and site selection will be informed by pertinent factors at the time, particularly emerging threat conditions. So my question is, knowing that we are facing emerging threats, whether it's Iran not abiding by the uranium restrictions in the JCPOA, the ongoing status of North Korea, the cancellation of the redesigned kill vehicle, the 10-year delay with NGI, these are all pertinent factors when it comes to our assessment of emerging threats and the conditions that we're facing. Would this prompt an operational requirement from your perspective for a third CONUS interceptor site?
Congressman, what I like to do is take that back to actually my staff, both military and uniform, to get their assessment. Obviously, it has to be threat-driven. Many of the studies have been conducted so far on some of the sites, but it is threat-driven. I probably warrants an update to find out as circumstances have changed on the ground with regard to Iran in particular, does it warrant a relook or an updated assessment?
And Chairman Milley, I would like your assessment of the threats as you look to the future for missile defense.
Yeah, basically the same thing. Right now, it's a little bit too early to tell with respect to Iran as to whether the need is there yet or not, because we do know that as of today, a intercontinental ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear weapon has not been fully developed and tested by Iran. But we don't know what the future is going to hold. So it's something that we're under constant evaluation on. Specifically, what you're talking about is a missile defense array, an array of layered defenses like we have in the Pacific, also on the East Coast. But we're taking a hard look at it. And the decisions are not yet made, but we owe the studies back to the Secretary of Defense for decision.
So as you know, Mr. Secretary, Fort Drum was selected as the preferred location for an East Coast missile defense capability. In the 2019 MDR, it directs 12 follow-on studies that should be conducted for missile defense to include the necessity of an East Coast site. Is that study complete? Are you able to share the results of that study? If not, when can we expect those results?
Yeah, those are great questions. I don't have the answer. Let me take that back and get back to you, Congresswoman.
Great. Really important for my district, very important for our broader missile defense discussions. Shifting gears, I wanted to ask about coronavirus. Last night, U.S. Forces Korea confirmed the first case of a soldier with coronavirus. And given the metastasization that we're seeing within CENTCOM and EUCOM and around the world, whether it's in Italy, whether it's in the Middle East, how is DoD addressing this, and particularly what is your perspective on the potential impact for our joint training exercises and our overall readiness?
Sure. It's so first of all, many of the commands have established plans for dealing with things like this. I'm sure the chairman can speak to that. On 1st of February, as this emerged coming out of China, I signed a campaign plan that directed NORTHCOM to integrate all of our operations with regard to the coronavirus. The commander, General O'Shaughnessy, has been implementing that. We meet daily, my team, on a basis. There's also an interagency team working this. Between him and OSD staff, the personnel and readiness, we've issued a variety of memorandums advising the force on how to deal with the coronavirus, the tools in their toolkit. We continue to respond to requests for information. I've empowered the commanders, in this case, Indo-PACOM. I met with Admiral Davidson yesterday, but I get frequent updates from General Abrams on the peninsula with regard to what's happening in Korea. But we're taking a look at all this. My first priority is protection of our people, both service members and families, and then make sure we protect our ability to accomplish our mission. So those are the two priorities for me. And then third, I want to make sure we can support the interagency as they need support from DoD and what we bring to the table.
And with respect to exercises we're taking a look at specifically, as you know, the center of gravity of the thing is in China, but South Korea, Japan, some other countries, Italy, in fact, in Europe, are the next countries that have the highest number of infected cases. So we're taking a hard look at that with the joint exercise with the Republic of Korea Army that are coming up and whether or not they continue, postpone, or modified. We're waiting for the final recommendations of General Abrams and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Iraq Army, General Park, to see what those are. More broadly, though, I want to put some of this in context. Coronavirus is a very serious thing. We, the U.S. military, and we, the Department of Defense, are taking all kinds of appropriate precautions. We've enacted one of our global pandemic plans that worked this, and that's what he was talking about with O'Shaughnessy, et cetera. We also need to keep it in context as well.
And I do apologize, Mr. Chairman. The general time has expired. I think that's
Roger that. The rest of it will be for the record, ma'am.
Thanks.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper, the President's budget requests funding to begin Phase 1 for the W-93 nuclear warhead. However, as late as August 2019, the NNSA referred to a, quote, next Navy warhead, unquote, but estimated that the weapon would not need funding until 2023. I have a three-part question. Why has the timeline shifted forward by 2 years? 2, does the department plan to maintain the 3 other warheads in the submarine leg, the W-76-1, the 76-2, and the W-88, if this warhead is developed? And 3, the 76-1 life was extended only a few years ago, and the W-88 is about to enter production. Both will last a decade. Why the rush?
Congressman, I'd have to refer you to NNSA on those questions. Maybe number 2 I can help on and get back to you, but those certainly 1 and 3 are NNSA questions. I don't have the answer for you at this point in time.
I'd appreciate your follow-up. Well, 2, let me continue with you, Secretary Esper. As we all know, New START is expected to expire in February 2021, in just 1 year. What are the risks for allowing New START to expire without a replacement? Is negotiating an extension a priority for the administration this year?
The administration is, I have not yet met at my level yet with my counterparts to discuss the way forward. We hope to engage on that soon. Beyond that, there's nothing I can add to the question you've asked.
That's disconcerting. Well, let me continue with General Milley. The Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States and is a partner in our efforts to fight against terrorism. The U.S. signed the Visiting Forces Agreement, VFA, and an Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement as a sign of our close defense partnership. With the government of the Philippines submitting a notice of termination of the VFA, have you been in contact with your counterparts to decide next steps in the U.S.-Philippine defense relationship? And 2, will this decision impact our freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea? And 3, how will the termination affect the Philippine government's ability to combat terrorist organizations?
We have concerns about the notification to terminate, and it's a 6-month notification, so we've got 6 months to work it out. I have not yet personally called my counterpart on that notification. I do intend to do that, but I'm still working through the staff exactly what our position is going to be. If it is implemented, and again, this is 6-month notification, if that is implemented, then yes, it would have an impact on U.S. military force posture and our exercises and a wide variety of other things. We want access, basing, overflight rights, those sorts of things in relative to the South China Sea. Philippines is key. We've had a long-standing relationship with the Philippines. We want to keep our visiting forces agreement in place, if possible. That'll be a decision for the Philippine government, but we think it's an important thing for the mutual defense of both the Philippines and the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary and Chairman, I am number one, I'm very concerned about security at our southern border. Always have been, not just at our southern border, but all our borders, all our ports of entry, and our entire immigration policy to make sure that we're only letting folks who are friendly to the United States in. That being said, I think we risk a whole lot with the $3.8 billion reprogramming to fund a border wall without consulting with Congress. And at a minimum, I think it would be much easier and that we would, for short-term progress, if you at least discuss with the chair and ranking member what we're going to reprogram and how we're going to reprogram. I think at a minimum, if you discuss with those two, that would make that a whole lot more palatable to all of us. That being said, I'm supportive of the President's policy on the border, but we have to be careful about how we reprogram. Now, I want to talk about the $3.8 billion. The National Guard is 40% of our combat forces. Yet the cuts in the reprogramming of the $3.8 billion is $1 billion, or 30% of the total budget comes out of the Guard. I think that is alarming to me, because if we're relying on 40% of our force to be able to fight tomorrow, as General Milley has said over and over again, we've got to be able to fight tonight. We've got to get those guys in the fight. And what we're doing is taking away the ability for them to keep pace with our active component counterparts with equipment. So Secretary Esper and Chairman Milley, just please tell me that you are planning on making sure that our Guard and Reserve will continue to be an operational force with these cuts and future cuts.
Mr. Kelly, the Guard and Reserve are actually very important critical components of the total force, whether it's Army or Air Force. Everywhere I travel around the world, I see Guardsmen and Reservists standing shoulder to shoulder with active duty. The integration is seamless. Their professionalism is exceptional. And so I think there is the commitment by me, I'm sure by the chairman, he'll speak to it, and the services to make sure that the Guard and Reserve has the tools and equipment and everything they need to perform those important missions.
And Secretary, I just
You got my commitment as well.
thank you. And I knew that, Chairman Milley. I knew the answer from both of you. I was hoping. The second part of that is we have the Futures Command, which I think is the absolute way that we need to start acquisition, and it is a great program. And the development is, have been in brief, we're doing great things in the Futures Command. What concerns me is, though, is when I see the patch chart for the fielding, there are no Guard and Reserve units in that fielding. I think we need to make sure that we don't field next generation stuff to the active component and then give the left behinds to the Guard and Reserve. And I hope that when we look at the fielding of those systems, that, and I don't think there's a proportionality thing there. I think it's the units that are going down range to do the mission ought to be on the newest and best equipment the United States has to offer. Do you guys agree with that?
I do. I'm a little surprised. I know the last time we discussed this in our previous rules, and certainly General McConville and Secretary McCarthy agreed. I recall National Guard units being some of the early fielders of some of the equipment we were considering. So I'll certainly take that back and have them follow up with you.
Thank you, and I may have just missed it. I just want to make sure that they're on that. The second thing I want to talk about is I just got back from Africa with Senator Inhofe. And I can tell you every African president, prime minister that we met with while we were there, all the military and State Department folks that we met with were there, we do not need to reduce the number of troops that we have. It's a great economy of force mission. I think we get great return for investment. I think we have some real threats, both terrorists and great power competition in that region. And I just think that we need to be judicious in making sure that we don't reduce the amount of troops there. We at least keep them the same or either invest a little more to make sure, because I think the return on investment is great. And the final thing that I'll say in my final 40-something seconds is I hope that we will continue to stay committed and work with the State Department on the IMET programs. We are losing opportunities that we cannot regain for the next 30 years when all of us will be long gone out of government. We need to make those relationships, and I use it as a point in case. When I was in Iraq a week ago, the Chad, I actually served with him in 5 in Iraq. That relationship matters. That familiarity matters. And so I think we need to make sure we continue to invest in IMET and not be so quick to take them off the list, Secretary.
Completely agree. In the 6 seconds, I tell you, during my time in uniform, I participated in these programs, sponsored foreign students. You're absolutely correct. I think it's the best investment our country can make. I put 10% growth in a budget this year. I want to get 50% growth by the end of the fight-up. I'd ask, we're going to ask for legislative authority to expand it under DOD terms and not just state, so that we can actually then prioritize it and allocate it where we need it as well. But I think it's a great investment for our country, and the more we can do, the better.
Thank you. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus my questions and comments on Africa. I am actually excited that not only did the chairman raise Africa as an issue, but you see that there's bipartisan interest in Africa. It's probably the most we've talked about Africa outside of an AFRICOM posture hearing of all the hearings that I've participated in this committee. And before I say anything or ask a question, I do want to, highlight that Africa is not a monolithic continent, and there's a diversity and variety of challenges and opportunities. So I visited Africa, started in Stuttgart, AFRICOM, when General Townsend, soon after he took command. It was a bipartisan delegation. And I was very much interested in the comment that General Townsend made at the end of January, I think before the Senate, and he said that at AFRICOM, we recognize the strategic environment is changing, and the joint force must orient the bulk of our efforts against China and Russia, even as we counter VEOs that threaten America. In Africa, the CVEO fight is a key component of global power competition, as these efforts are not mutually exclusive. So my question, I mean, we often, great power competition, China, we think Indo-Pacific. Great power competition, Russia, we think Europe. And I'd like you to kind of describe for the committee, in as much detail as you can, what is great power competition with China and Russia in Africa? And is there an intersection with the CVO effort or not?
It's a great question, because this is the strategy, right? The great power competition is global with China and Russia, but we'll just focus on China. We see China busy in South America. frankly, in every continent. We see.
No, but I want to go right to Africa. Let's just stay right on Africa.
No, completely agree, because we see them in the Arctic too. But in Africa, you see them in terms of certain countries maybe trying to get port authorities, maybe access to critical materials, minerals, et cetera. So that is happening through not all of Africa, but through many critical parts. Obviously, they're in Djibouti. And so as we look at the continent, all 53, 54 countries, we've got to ask ourselves, what's important to us? And and make sure we sustain that, if not improve that. And then what are the Chinese going after and why, and understanding that. And it may or may not require a presence by either the military or state or USAID or whoever the case may be.
So you, in response to a letter that I wrote along with 10 of my colleagues, bipartisan letter, you did respond. I appreciate it. And you mentioned today about the SFAB substitution for the 101st Airborne. The commander, Brigadier General Jackson, he commented recently that they're not going to have the military structure like they had in Afghanistan, and network of bases, supply chains, readily available helicopters and other lift. What are we doing to ensure that the SFAB has the infrastructure they need to do their job?
Well, obviously,
what is that investment look like?
Obviously, two different theaters. Africa, very austere. I might let the chairman speak to this, but we're not going to put them out there without the means to do their job. They are, again, ideally suited, prepared, trained, organized to do the train, advise, and assist mission, and we'll make sure they have what they need to get the job done.
Yeah, I'd like to hear detail, because I've been to Qualm in West Niger, I've been to Diffa in East Niger. Special operators do a great job out there in kind of sparse conditions. SFAB is a lot different. Can you please talk maybe in some detail, General Milley, how we're going to support them with the infrastructure?
Yeah, so Steve Townsend, General Townsend, the commander of AFRICOM, is conducting a review, the blank slate review that everyone's talked about. Part of that is the infrastructure. How is he going to adjust the infrastructure based on the prioritization of the countries, based on the U.S. national security interests, and then the SFAB will overlay on top of that, the soldiers from the SFAB. Just so we're clear, though, the SFAB is not Special Operations Forces. However, they are trained and explicitly selected to be able to operate in an expeditionary manner in very austere environments. They knew that going into it. They volunteered for that, and they are specifically trained to train or specifically prepared to train, advise, assist, coach, teach, mentor, and accompany indigenous forces in the conduct of their operations. So the SFABs conduct a foreign internal defense mission. That is their very narrow mission set. They don't do all the other special forces missions, but they are capable of operating in very austere
So let me just use my last 20 seconds in making this comment. I completely understand, but General Jackson made those comments because he does have concerns about the infrastructure support, logistics support that he'll get while he's on the ground. And unlike what we demand in Korea and in other places, we cannot ask African nations to foot the bill because they are broke.
Well, the infrastructure for General Jackson and his guys is going to be very austere.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gallagher.
Chairman Courtney, in talking about the shipbuilding plan, I thought delivered an assessment that was tough but fair, and I think reflects bipartisan frustration about the different force structure assessments we've had, the lack of a shipbuilding plan in this case. And so I'd like to just clarify something, Mr. Secretary, that you said. You said in response, I believe, to something he asked, that you had not yet seen the 30-year shipbuilding plan. You're awaiting it to be presented to you. Right. Could you clarify that? Because there was a report yesterday from Breaking Defense that you have been given the plan and have been reviewing it for 2 weeks, but are awaiting that plan versus potentially a plan that's coming from CAPE. And this is all just in the spirit of, we want to see the plan. We want to get your vision for what the future fleet looks like and work with you.
No, it's, I think there's confusion, a little bit misreporting. So I was briefed last Friday, a few days ago, on the INFSA, which was the Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment. That I had a lot of questions coming out of that, but that is not the 30-year shipbuilding plan. I asked again the Navy the other day, let's get it on my schedule. Come tell me what your shipbuilding plan is. Break. What I've said, what I want to do is to see what the Navy plan is. CAPE, my own internal think tank, has a plan to get this to 355 plus. And there's some great work going on out there by the think tanks and other places about what the future should look like to deal with, let's say, China in the year 2030 and beyond. And what I said is, what I want to do is get all these great ideas together, get some innovative thinking, and kind of level set the playing field, and let's run these competing plans and to see which one really optimizes what we need for the future. The two things we don't have, however, right now is an approved op plan, war plan, from which to baseline, and we should have that in a few months here. The other one's going to take time. We can't wait for it, but it's going to be the new joint warfighting doctrine, because we fight as a joint force. We just don't fight as the Navy or as the Air Force or as the Marine Corps. We fight as a joint force, and I want to make sure that I recognize that we're beyond the date that was due, but I want to present to you a right plan, a good plan, and not just something that was generated up and delivered on time. I think we owe you that. The Marine Corps is doing some extraordinary thinking, the Commandant, on how he wants to reorganize his force, and I think we owe you that. The Chairman, I'm going to ask him to review it because he's my senior military advisor, but then present to Congress what is really a well-thought-out, innovative, takes everything into consideration to include surge, Sealift, but a different composition of force.
So just so I understand in simplest terms, you have the Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment, which you've been briefed on, but you are going to sort of balance that off against potentially an alternative analysis by CAPE, as well as some outside thinkers, come up with what you view to be the force structure assessment, and that will be a source document for the 30-year shipbuilding.
Yeah, we actually kind of have 4 plans right now. You have the 21 plan, you have the FIDIP, you have the INFSA, which is a 10 to 15-year plan, then you have the 30-year plan. As we know, the further you go out, the less credible they become. But I want to look at those. There are some questions with regard to INFSA that I have that I'm concerned about. So an assumption in the INFSA is that the OFRP works. The OFRP hasn't worked for years, so why should we assume that it will work in the future? So there are assumptions I want to go back and have discussions with the Navy about how do we make, and there are others, there's assumptions in there about ships and warfighting that I want to make sure we get right, so when I present you the plan, it's defensible and I feel confident in it, and the Chairman feels confident in it, that we think this is where we should be in the future.
Can you give us any, I know this is a very complicated process, but could you give us any sort of notional timeline about when we can expect to be briefed on that? I know it seemed that you were looking over my colleague, Ms. Laurie, and you've made comments in the past.
We've had a lot of conversations.
OFRP, I know. You've made some comments about trying to bring Congress into that process. I think that's wise.
I do. I want to run a process.
Particularly bringing Ms. Laurie into that process because she's smarter on this than most every other human being.
I'm pushing. I've anointed the DepSecDef to run this. I want to move quickly in a matter of a few short months. I want to find key points in there where we can invite interested members of Congress in to look at the process, what we're doing. Does that make sense? Does it pass the common sense test? And then at the end, we see what comes up. I think we should invite the Navy's future leadership into this process, whether they're young ensigns and lieutenants, or whatever the case may be, to help inform this, because they're going to have to, this is the Navy they're going to sail, that they're going to fight. And I just want to kind of open the lens up and get the best assessment from everybody, to include inviting interested members in.
Well, and just to close, I want to commend what you had said earlier about just kind of your hunch about where the fleet needs to go in terms of smaller ships, experimenting with optionally manned, unmanned ships. I think if you can make a geopolitically informed, in other words, something that makes sense in terms of geography and international politics, case to this committee, I think you would find a lot of support, notwithstanding the very real concerns that Chairman Courtney and others have articulated. And
no, thank you. I mean, that is my ambition. Like I said, I'm a big believer in attack subs. From what I've seen, I think we need more than what has been there in the past.
Thank you. Mr. Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary and General, for your service. As you know, Mr. Secretary, we were in Munich with a delegation with Speaker Pelosi, and the delegation was unified in echoing the message that European countries shouldn't be using Huawei. One of the questions that came up from the former president of Estonia was, well, if you're not going to tell us to if you're telling us not to use Huawei, what alternative are you providing? And as you know, there's been a report that suggests that one of the things the United States should be doing is allowing medium and low-range spectrum to be used to develop an alternative. I mean, just the high-speed spectrum isn't sufficient. My question for you is, have you considered that? What do you think we need to do with either Nokia and Ericsson or other industry to help develop alternatives, and whether you'd be willing to come out to the Defense Innovation Unit in Silicon Valley and discuss some of these strategies?
Yes, I would like to come out. I'm actually trying to make a trip out to the West Coast to speak to them and some others. So yes, Congressman, for sure. We have a lot of great Western companies, and I don't want to exclude any Japanese, let's just say non-Chinese companies out there that I think provide great products. I'm very concerned about Huawei. I spoke about it publicly in Munich, as did the speaker. The DoD is investing hundreds of millions of dollars to set up prototypes at 4 of our bases around the country where we could invite companies in to test, because we would benefit from 5G. I'm conscious of the time. The last thing I would say on the 5G side is that a lot of U.S. companies at least want to go to the mid-band range. The mid-band range is between 3,100 and 3,550 megahertz. It's where we operate our air defense systems, whether it's AWACS, whether it's Navy Aegis, or Army and Marine Corps air defense systems. Private sector wants that. We need that. We're willing to share it. We think that's the way is to share this. The technology is out there, I'm told, to do that. I think that's the best way to move forward so we can meet the economic priority with the national security priority.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. I appreciate that. My next question concerns encryption. Your department has understandably, and I think rightfully, talked about the importance of encryption. Now, there's some people who are saying, well, let's have a back door. And I guess from a national security perspective, I really don't understand that. I mean, if you were to tell Apple to have a backdoor key to get into every iPhone, would you really want to risk having Apple have that technology that could be hacked by any employee or the Chinese and then have access to every phone in this country or world? And so, you know, it seems that the administration actually has different approaches to encryption.
Yeah, what specific question can I answer?
So, you know, your department has said encryption is really important to protect these phones. The Attorney General is asking Apple or some other companies to create a backdoor key. Now, a backdoor key, just to be clear, would be Apple would have it. So basically, any employee at Apple, if you create a backdoor key, would be able to break into any phone. And who knows who's working at Apple? I guess I just would wonder whether you could be working with the Justice Department to look at the national security implications of having a backdoor to encryption.
Okay, I'm not completely fluent with what the Department of Justice's views on the law enforcement side of it. Clearly, for DoD, we need encryption to pass classified data, operational plans, et cetera, amongst ourselves and with allies and partners. So I can take that back for you.
I appreciate that. And my final question is, you know, when we were in Germany, one thing that struck me is that the Bundestag actually has to approve every increase in troops anywhere around the world. Now, obviously, that's asking a lot for Congress to be able to do that. But is there a way Congress could be more involved in understanding exactly where our troops are and decisions about how many troops we're sending and why, and have input in that?
I think that is been the longstanding prerogative of the Commander-in-Chief, but I do know I believe we have systems where we notify you of deployments. I'd have to check and see, but that's my understanding.
It would be great if we could even get a sense of where all we're deployed and have some ability to have an input in that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, I want to start by thanking you for your recent visit to my district. After my constituents were attacked by a terrorist, you brought calm and comfort, and I have been very encouraged by our discussions that DoD is doing everything necessary to ensure that we have a productive, safe, working environment for our service members and the service members that we host from foreign countries. And so I thank you for that great progress. I also want to thank you for the development of this budget that seems to prioritize our near-peer adversaries. There are enhancements in research, development, test, and evaluation dollars. We're particularly proud of that mission at Eglin Air Force Base, where the eastern Gulf of Mexico is an unparalleled range. There's money in the budget to enhance our ranges, and it's my hope that the department will continue to maintain the strong position opposed to offshore oil drilling, which is not consistent with the launching of experimental missiles, which is, I can't believe something I have to say out loud, but indeed it is. And so thank you for that great work. As the department is raising its gaze under your leadership to meet those challenges of the future against our near-peer adversaries, it's notable to me that we have deconflicted in Syria from what was U.S. involvement in a Syrian civil war with tremendous sectarian violence. In this budget you've presented to us, is there an expectation that our nation would re-engage in the Syrian civil war?
There has not been that discussion about re-engaging in the Civil War. We think the best path forward is through the UN process that is underway, and that needs to be pursued vigorously. I know the State Department is pushing that as well, and obviously the situation has become a lot more complicated in Idlib province right now, given the confluence of many actors.
And in our current role, securing oil fields so that the Kurds are able to maintain their own resistance and to have resources to do that, is it our expectation in this budget that we would be funding efforts to reinsert Americans on the Turkish-Syria border in that area where Americans were previously withdrawn?
Our current mission, Congressman, is to ensure the continuing defeat of ISIS in that eastern portion of Syria, working alongside our SDF partners. That happens on a daily basis. At this point in time, I don't see any likelihood that we would be back along the border, if you will. That's
great news. And General Milley, I recall a conversation we had where you informed me that the only correct decision in your mind that the president could have made was the decision the president in fact did make, to take the tens of Americans on the Syria-Turkey border and to remove them from that conflict zone. Is that still your position?
It is, and I would just reinforce what the Secretary said. Our mission remains, primary mission remains a counter-ISIS mission there in the eastern parts of Syria, and to my knowledge there's no intent nor plans to reengage in the Syrian civil war, nor put troops back on the Syrian-Turkish border.
Again, great news. I very much look forward to the Trump presidency being one where we end our involvement in some of these wars rather than reigniting new conflicts in new places for newfound reasons that distract us from that important national security strategy focus that I think the two of you have led quite deftly. In budgetary times, we're always looking forward, but at times it's appropriate to look back at the decisions the Congress has made and determine whether or not we've got the right focus. And I'm specifically referencing House Joint Resolution 77, which was supported by most of the members of this committee, Republican and Democrat, and it was very critical of the administration's decision to disengage from that civil war. And specifically in the whereas clause of that resolution, it says, whereas an abrupt withdrawal of United States military personnel from certain parts of northeast Syria is beneficial to the adversaries of the United States government. I'm wondering if you concur with that statement, or now with the benefit of hindsight, we could say that disengaging from that conflict zone actually was beneficial to the United States government and our position.
I think from a military standpoint, we had two Special Forces ODAs, a very small amount of forces that were facing off against 15,000 Turkish troops, and they were going to come across that border. They were prepared to come across that border. They told us to come across that border, and we had very, very little choice except to remove them from the avenues of attack that the Turks were going to do. Otherwise, we would have unnecessarily jeopardized their lives for no purpose.
And given that decision that we made, I think very correctly, despite the fact that many of my colleagues disagree with it, I agree with it, are we sensing that there is some insurmountable resurgence of ISIS that we're not prepared to deal with as a consequence of that sound decision?
We know that ISIS, the caliphate, the physical entity, has been eliminated. We also know that ISIS as an organization is not yet destroyed. They have broken down into small groups, and they're continuing to conduct insurgency and terrorist operations in a very disparate and disaggregated way. But they are no longer the threat that they were just a year ago.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cisneros.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, both for being here today. Policy cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea has been at best inconsistent under the Trump and Moon administrations. I'm concerned with the department's plan to move forward with basing U.S. troops in South Korea and maintaining operational readiness given the underlying tensions associated with an expired special measures agreement. The President's administration's demanded that South Korea increase its payments to the U.S. by 400%, and the administration's public statements questioning whether or not the presence of U.S. troops in South Korea is even in our interest. General Milley, what is the strategic significance of basing U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula, and how does it positively impact our national security?
We have a bilateral defense agreement with the Republic of Korea, and that requires, the requirement has been for 7 decades now to have forces there to prevent an outbreak of yet another Korean War. And I would argue that you can never prove a negative as to why something didn't happen, but I would argue that U.S. forces in South Korea have deterred North Korean aggression, territorial aggression, and have prevented the outbreak of a second Korean War. I think that outbreak of that war is, the prevention of that is in the U.S. national security interest for general stability in Northeast Asia, but also for global stability. So I think it is a vital U.S. national security interest to maintain our treaty agreement with South Korea and maintain U.S. forces there.
All right. So we want to make sure that we do maintain the U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula.
That's my military opinion. That's correct.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Also, the U.S. desire to maintain rule-based international order in the Indo-Pacific AOR with China's desire to build military capability and expand influence in the region. What policies are in place to prevent potential escalation of hostilities should an act of aggression be perceived by either side towards the other on a tactical level? Can you identify any potential gaps in communication between senior leaders on either side of the operational or strategic levels in order to de-escalate a potential volatile situation should it arise?
You're talking about with China?
Yes, sir.
Specifically? Well, a couple of things. Both in air and maritime, we maintain communication systems that we do communicate to each other so that we don't have inadvertent incidents at sea or in the air that could then escalate. So there's an escalation control mechanism. I have and will continue to maintain a communication channel with my counterpart. I know the Secretary does as well, and I know the Commander U.S. PACOM or Indo-PACOM has channels of communication, try to de-escalate any kind of issue. At the broader geostrategic level, I think it's in our national security interest to continue to maintain adequate forces there, and at the end of the day, it goes towards that great power competition and the preservation of great power peace. The last thing that anyone needs is a war between China and the United States or a war between Russia and the United States. So great power war is a really bad thing, and great power peace has been maintained for 7.5 decades, and we want to continue that legacy of maintaining that peace.
And just one more question about China. In what specific areas is the People's Republic of China investing in terms of military capability, and how are we countering their investments?
Without going into specific classification, I think China is, since the Deng Xiaoping's reforms in 1979, they've made huge economic advances, 10% a year, and they're down to about 6 or 7% a year over the last 40 years. And with that, history tells us that countries tend to develop a very significant military capability, and that is in fact the case with China. So they've developed all the domains, space, cyber, land, sea, and air, the traditional domains. They've developed those significantly over the course of the last 40 years. They are not our peer yet, but their objective is to be the co-equal, military co-equal of the United States and even surpass the United States militarily by mid-century. They've said that publicly. They're on trend lines to do that, and that's what this budget is all about, is efforts to try to mitigate the Chinese from closing the gaps or, in fact, overtaking us in some capabilities.
All right. And Secretary Esper, just one last question. There have been improvements in diversity in the officer ranks since the military became an all-volunteer force after 1973. There's still disproportionate demographic representation in the officer ranks. What specific steps is the department taking to recruit, retain minority officers so our officer corps better reflects U.S. general population demographics? And I'm running out of time, so I can take that for the record.
Okay, let me get back to you with details, but I would say I completely agree. I think we are, more than any other institution, really embrace diversity and have a very diverse officer corps workforce and enlisted and NCO corps, but we can always do better and should do better.
All right. I yield
Thank
back.
you. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the co-chair of the Future of Defense Task Force, a role that I share with Representative Moulton on a bipartisan basis, I'm optimistic about the role that the National Security Innovation Base, and more specifically non-traditional defense companies, can play in emerging technologies. Space is one of the domains that's attracting a great deal of commercial innovation. And while I'm encouraged by the establishment of the Space Force, I'm disheartened by federal acquisition regulations that create barriers to entry for small startup companies unable to dedicate the significant resources needed to navigate the DoD's massive bureaucracy. Mr. Secretary, if we view the establishment of Space Force as an opportunity to revitalize our approach, what can be done to reorganize the FAR to include more new, innovative companies in our defense ecosystem?
Thank you, Mr. Banks. I think, first of all, I agree with you. I think so much of the innovation and entrepreneurialism is out there with the small providers, and that's why we stood up Forces Command in the Army to tap into that. The Air Force is doing things like pitch days to get at that. The regulations are a tough thing. We recently published an update to the FAR, the 5000 series, and we should come brief you on that to get at that and bring you ideas, because we have some challenges. Some is regulatory that we control and policy. Some are required by law that you might be able to help with. We've had a lot of good reforms the last few years that have helped us in terms of prototyping, mid-tier going, stuff like that. The biggest challenge we have, frankly, is culture, and we have to change our culture so it's less risk-averse and more willing to kind of make bets on the small guys and kind of feed that, because you find a lot of success there, a lot of great ideas, and that's going to be where we're going to get our best is from the
Can we use the Space Force as an experiment in some ways to do that by cracking down on the FAR, maybe just for the Space Force
I would
versus the other branches?
fully support that. I had a great conversation with General Raymond yesterday about that, about how he has the chance to rewrite everything with regard to not just acquisition, but the force. And that's one of the reasons, frankly, we stood up the SDA, is to kind of break out of the conventional system and find different, more creative ways to fill our capabilities.
The department has identified artificial intelligence as one of the core technologies that warrant additional investment and has designated the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center as the lead of the department. We've met as part of our task force hearings with the Joint AI Center Lieutenant General Shanahan and have been impressed with his leadership across the services and building relationships with industry and academia. With his pending retirement and the competition for general officer billets, I wanted to stress how important today strong military leadership is within the Joint AI Center. The next few years for that would be critical. Mr. Secretary, what actions are you taking to ensure continued leadership of artificial intelligence in the department and in the Joint AI Center specifically?
Yeah, I completely agree, Congressman. He's done a great job standing it up, working closely with Dana Deasy. We need to find a great replacement to carry on his good work. At the same time, we've increased the budget by over 4% because I think AI is a game changer out there in the years ahead. The Army stood up the AI task force at Carnegie Mellon University with a very capable commander there. At the same time, we're trying to use the authorities Congress gave us to bring more people from the outside into the system so that we could tap into that rich civilian talent out there. And again, they have good plans to continue that along, and we're growing the JAIC as quickly as we can to meet those needs.
Thank you. Biometric identifiers, as both of you know, plays an increasingly important role in military technological capabilities and threats. Again, we've heard a great deal from a number of experts in our Future Defense Task Force hearings about this subject. In December 2019, the DoD issued a directive advising U.S. service members against using genetic testing kits such as 23andMe. The memo states, quote, "The test could expose personal and genetic information and potentially create unintended security consequences and increase risk to the joint force and mission," end quote. General Milley, I wonder if you could maybe comment about what could the possible national security implications be if an adversary like China gained access to the genetic makeup of U.S. service members?
There's a lot of things that the Chinese are working on, which I'm not going to discuss in an open hearing, but when you expose any type of personal identity information, it can be exploited. And we know that the Chinese have extracted thousands, if not millions, of records a couple of years ago. They have everything from fingerprints and all your biometrics and your eye color and all that, description, all your contacts, your families, all that kind of business, right? Adding DNA to it just multiplies that ability to exploit you as an individual. And there's all kinds of things that can be done. And I don't want to, spook the herd, but there's a lot of things that can be done with exploiting personal information such as DNA.
Particularly at a time when they're building a 21st century surveillance state in China. If you think about them exporting that technology abroad and be able to identify key Americans, whatever the case may be.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to you all for being here today. I want to first just associate myself and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle with my concern about moving already congressionally appropriated money towards the border wall, and also my concerns about making sure that we're thinking very hard about our role and presence in Africa as we see the rise of China in the area. But my questions are actually a little bit more mundane and have a lot more to do with regards to the committees that I serve on, specifically readiness and emerging threats. And my first question, and I have 4, and so if I'm not able to get time, I might be able to submit them to the record, has to do with just being a woman in the military. I separated, and one of the reasons I separated in the late 80s and early 90s was due to access to childcare. My base up at Hanscom Air Force Base was an expensive area to live in and had a 6-month wait list in order for me to access the base childcare. And so one of the things that I see with the rising presence of women in the military and the rising need for more people in the military, a population of 51% of us are women, is that we really need to be able to allow women and their families to be able to bring their whole selves to work so that we can support these active duty women and their families in their pursuit of their careers, and also so that we can be ready. And so my question is, with the record number of women entering the military, would you please be able to share with the committee what the department is doing and what aspects of the President's budget are doing to ensure that mechanisms exist and are in place for childcare and other such things to support the warrior? And first, before I allow you to answer that question, I would note that right now the base childcare lists are upwards of a year wait list. When I separated almost 30 years ago, they were 6 months.
And it's terrible. We've got to do a better job. This has been a top priority for me as Army Secretary, both child care and spouse hiring, licensure, reciprocity. I just spoke out in Minot and Omaha about this thing. The services are investing in terms of child care, but there's a lot we can do at the policy level and that I'm doing at the policy level. So just last week I signed a new policy that elevated military kids in terms of getting the priority of care. That is going to clean a lot of the lists out so that folks like yourself have access to it. I know when I was in service, my wife didn't have access to that type of care, and our son. And so the policy, a lot of what we can do on a policy side will free that up. The 2 other areas, as I talk to spouses or talk to service members that they need, are greater access to hourly care, which is important, and then more flexibility in terms of 24/7 care. That, to me, is the next challenge. Once we can kind of get that piece, is kind of move to those new phases, and I think that's what I hear from service members and from their spouses.
And I really look forward to working with you guys on this critical issue. I helped found the Service Women and Women Veterans Caucus, and we're about 50-some strong right now, the first caucus of its kind to focus on these issues. And last cycle of NDAA, we had some amendments that were successful in investigating this particular issue, and I'm really concerned about it. As we increasingly have more and more women, we need to be focused on that. General, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
I would just echo what the Secretary said. There are a series of policies that can be improved, one of which is, as he mentioned, prioritizing military children over the non-military, non-uniformed folks that are entitled to the same benefits. And that's going to make a big difference, I think, in terms of these wait lists. And I have been 40 years now in the military, and my family's grown up in the military. And there's probably nothing more important than taking care of our families in order for the soldier, the sailor, the airman, marine, in order to focus on their job and maintain high levels of readiness. So it's a critical area, and we all recognize it.
Thank you. And with my last kind of minute and a half, I wanted to talk a little bit more about readiness, and this time in tech talent. I'm also an engineer and one of about a dozen in the Congress right now, and we, as we know, need increasingly more and more tech talent in the military as well. On last year's NDAA, one of the amendments, Armed Forces Digital Advantage Act, which I proposed, was part of the NDAA, and it established a policy to recruit, retain, and promote tech talent and digital expertise in the DoD. The bill was enacted in Section 230 of last year's NDAA, and it isn't supposed to be until May that I first hear reports on that. But I wanted to know, sir, if you had anything that you could report on that, and specifically the legislation also included authorization for a czar that would be effectively appointed. Do you intend on appointing that individual, and have you made progress on that?
I'd like to read the legislation, let the team brief me kind of what's in it, and then go from there. But I will tell you this much. This is very important. It's critical to the JAIC in terms of artificial intelligence, the cyber world. We have a deficit of people with that background of digital skills, the engineering skills. That's the one, as I talk to our people and as I talk to industry, that's one of the things we need. So I'm looking for any authorities that we can bring people in, retain them, do things outside the normal to make sure we can recruit and retain that type of valuable talent.
Thank you, and I have run out, and I will go ahead and submit the rest of my questions for the record, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Ms. Secretary, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, we're hearing reports that as the United States is prepared to sign a deal with Taliban shortly, that deal may in fact include secret annexes or side deals. Will you give assurances to this committee and make a commitment that any deal the United States enters into with the Taliban will be made public in its entirety?
I'm not aware of that per se. I know we're trying to get folks in the brief in the coming days here, but I'm not aware of that. I would defer to the State Department in terms of.
So you're not aware that there is any are you aware of any contemplation of any secret side deals with the Taliban?
Nothing comes to mind right now that you're mentioning. I know, again, I know there's the base agreement and some annexes. I don't know if those have been agreed upon as secret or something, but I'll certainly raise that with the Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We'll be raising it as well. I think it's crucial that the United States not go down the path that we saw, and frankly, the Secretary of State was so effective in with respect to the Iranian nuclear deal in uncovering secret annexes and side deals with respect to Iran.
We've tried to be very upfront.
Any deal that the United States would contemplate entering into with the Taliban should be made public in its entirety. General Milley, on this same topic, we've also seen reports that one of these secret annexes may in fact include some plan for counterterrorism cooperation, for some sort of a center for counterterrorism cooperation with the Taliban. Will you give the committee your assurance that you recognize the lunacy of pretending that the Taliban is a partner for counterterrorism cooperation and that there will be no center for counterterrorism cooperation between the United States and the Taliban?
I'll be candid. You're quoting things that I haven't seen. So, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I will take a rigorous look at whatever annexes are out there, and I have very, very strong feelings and opinions and lots of experience in Afghanistan with the Taliban. So I do give you my commitment that I'm going to give all of this a hard look. I am not aware of anything that you just described. I'm not even aware of it.
Is it your best military advice, Chairman Milley, that the Taliban is not an effective partner for counterterrorism?
I would, I mean, here's my view on the whole thing, from big to small, I suppose. We've been in a military stalemate for several years. We're not going to defeat the Taliban militarily, and they're not going to defeat the government of Afghanistan militarily. So the only responsible way to end this thing is through a negotiated settlement, and that's what's happening right now with this reduction in violence, and I support that 100%, and I support signing a peace agreement with the Taliban, fully recognizing what the Taliban is all about.
But Chairman Milley,
I don't want to say.
But with all due respect, Chairman Milley, though, I think the question is making sure that whatever troop level we have on the ground is a troop level that's determined based upon U.S. national security interests.
It's
and
totally based
and
on
that an agreement with the Taliban, for example, that would include secret annexes, that would include counterterrorism cooperation or intelligence sharing with the Taliban, which is a terrorist entity which continues to fight with al-Qaeda, would be counter to that. And finally, I would like to get your best military.
Number one, I'm not aware of it. Number two, I would not support sharing intelligence.
Great.
With that organization.
I would also like to get your commitment and your best military advice about the extent to which a commitment in an agreement with the Taliban for the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces, that putting such a commitment in writing with the Taliban right now would by definition be counter to making troop-level decisions based on conditions on the ground, and would also undermine our ally, the Afghan government. I know President Ghani has specifically asked us not to make that kind of a commitment for a complete withdrawal, and that such a commitment, again, and any sort of decisions about troop levels that are based on agreements with the Taliban would clearly not be in keeping with making those decisions based upon what's in the best interest of the United States. And I would also say I think the issue is not a complete defeat of the Taliban. I think the issue is what do we need to do to make sure that our enemies and that terrorists cannot establish safe havens.
Yeah, and I think that depending on, I think the whole thing is dependent upon conditions and depending upon Taliban behavior. And if the Taliban do not agree to continued reduction in violence and so on, then I think we're in a different place. But right now, things are looking good as of today, so we're going to see. It's conditions-based. We're going to take it step by step, week by week.
The standard is that Afghanistan never again becomes a place where a safe haven for terrorists to attack the United States, period. And at any point in time, it's completely conditions-based. We stop.
And I would just say, and I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary, I would just say ensuring or committing now that we are going to have a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces in this agreement makes it very difficult for us to have the credibility that we need to ensure that we cannot, to ensure that terrorists cannot in the future establish safe havens.
And Ms. Cheney will have to get the last word on that one. Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Secretary Esper, General Milley, for your continued service and your testimony here today. Secretary Esper, is it safe to say that China is a central focus of the National Defense Strategy?
It is the principal focus.
Is it safe to say that the acquisition of additional ships and aircraft are a central component of meeting that central focus?
Yes, they are, in an appropriate time frame.
Is the construction of barrier walls or a wall along the southern border, is that contained within the NDS?
Homeland Security is part of the NDS.
But specifically, is the construction of border barriers on our southern border contained within the NDS?
Well, there's a lot of things. A southwest border, there are a lot of things that are not in the NDS that we do and we fund and we put troops against all the time.
Is the reduction in the acquisition of F-35 aircraft and ships as a result of the reprogramming of funds to build additional borders, does that make it more challenging to meet the central focus, in your words, of the rise of China as a peer adversary?
Well, I go, again, based on the recommendation of the chairman that he made to me formally, and I'd say, again, the items that were sourced for the barrier were what we determined to be in the FY20 bill, either excess to need or early to need.
Well, I appreciate, you know, your efforts to try to support the President's reprogramming requests, but you have been very disciplined and very focused on making hard decisions, the discipline and a focus that I share, as a matter of fact. And you have long spoke about the need to cut back on missions in places where we are addressing very well-established threats. In the Middle East, for example, in reducing troop levels where we know there are terrorists. And it seems entirely inconsistent with me then that you then support the shifting of resources from well-established defense programs that are directly tied to meeting that central threat at the detriment of the NDS. You know, I would just urge you to be consistent in your focus. The next question is, do you anticipate additional need for money or resources to meet the coronavirus threat within the DoD?
We have not had that discussion yet internally. What I'd like to do is consult with the chairman. This is moving pretty quickly, and then get feedback from my combatant commanders and principally General O'Shaughnessy, Northern Command, who has the campaign order right now, and maybe get back to you in writing on that one.
There is some urgency. I think that's urgency that we share and members of this committee share. Public health officials have been ringing the alarm bells for quite some time. I think we are out of time. General Milley, would you care to comment on that?
No, I think the Secretary is exactly right. We've got to get with General O'Shaughnessy and assess the situation, but also with Admiral Davidson and General Walters over in Europe, because it is spreading, we can't give you a definitive answer whether we're going to need additional resource or not. We are taking all the appropriate measures right now, and we're doing the estimates of the situation, so we owe you some answers.
The quicker you can get those, the better. Obviously, we're having the discussions right now about funding and resources. We'll need that information to make sure that we're working together with the Pentagon to meet what I believe is a very urgent threat. So we appreciate your urgency behind that. Secretary Esper, do you believe that climate change is real?
Yes, I do, Congressman.
Do you believe that it's a threat to our national security and to our military?
I don't believe it's a threat to our national security as I've traditionally defined it. I do believe it's a challenge for our military installations that are confronted with the impact of climate change.
Do you believe that the well-established threat of refugees, increased pandemics, instability, and increased terrorism that could result from all of that instability pose additional challenges for us from a national security perspective?
They do. It's a chain of events, right, that create certain situations. We see that in many conflicts, you know, over time it's happened.
So destabilization and mass migration and refugee does pose a threat to our national security.
Well, it could create the situation by which we are encountered with a national security matter that could involve the military. But that's a series of ifs and whens and thises and that's.
General Milley, do you agree with that characterization?
I think I think climate change is real. I think it is probably going to result in increased destabilization with resource depletion, water, and things like that. You're going to see increases in diseases. There's a lot of second and third order effects. And does it impact on U.S. national security? Yes, it does.
Do you believe that we're making the efforts right now to address those increased threats?
I think we're making reasonable efforts, yes.
Do you believe that there could be more that we could be doing to address the threats?
Right now, in terms of the international piece, no. In terms of our basing and infrastructure here in CONUS, which was one of the previous questions, I think we've got to look at all of our infrastructure to make sure that it can withstand things like rising seas and increased storms and so on and so forth. And that is a level of effort DOD's been
and the gentleman's time has
Thank you,
expired.
Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your endurance. I want to augment and reinforce Mr. Kelly's comments before he left here about the Guard and Reserve. I mean, if in fact we use the term, if we're going to fight tonight, whether you be active or reserve, we need to make sure that the Guard and Reserve is not viewed as a bill payer for the active component, because all we have to do is look back at the example of, let's say, 1953 on for a period of 15 years and what we had capability-wise or lack thereof in the Guard and Reserve component, okay? I would, you know that, I just need to feel it's important to reinforce that as we do budgets and as we do bill payers, because it just, we have to maintain the capability of the total force. I would, one of my colleagues mentioned being an all-volunteer force. I would suggest to you we're an all-recruited force, because if you've ever been a recruiter, you know that you have a mission to accomplish. And where we have our long-term talent management, retention talent challenges, is to retain the best of the best, whether we retain them on active duty or they do transition to the Guard and Reserve, but those talents that we need to keep the best of the best for as long as possible in uniform. I want to switch subjects here for you on just for a second. General Milley, you mentioned early on in the hearing about a strategy-driven budget, is what I wrote down. And now, having used your terms, Secretary Esper, does the strategy include serious efforts to control internal costs, reduce waste, and streamline, if you will, a forward-thinking Department of Defense business model? Because we can talk about things and capabilities, but if our business processes are just funneling money down black holes, I need to hear your thoughts on what we're doing on that part of the strategy.
Absolutely. We have to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollar day in and day out. I think it begins in many cases with the audit. It was mentioned earlier, but not discussed. I'm a big believer in the audit. It shows you a lot about yourself. You look in the mirror and find out, you know, your inventory, where you're spending money, losing money, whatever the case may be. And we need to continue along that process until we get a clean opinion. And that will take some time. But there's a lot of process reform we can do. I think in time we will get there using AI that can help us a lot in terms of understanding our processes, doing better on maintenance. And then look, you just got to go back every now and then and clean. I shouldn't say every now and then. I think annually you have to make it a business of going back and looking at what you've been doing, whether it's, I call it the defense-wide review, and getting rid of the old, getting rid of the legacy, getting rid of the low return on investment. And that's hard for people to do. It's hard for people up here to do. And that's the only way we can kind of shed the past and keep moving forward, because you know, $740 billion is a lot of money for the nation's security, and we appreciate that. So I'm committed to making good use of every penny, nickel, and dollar.
Well, you know, you said in your own words, the Jim Collins good to great. Every year, keep doing what you need to keep doing, start doing what you're not doing, but most importantly and most difficult is stop doing what you no longer need to be doing. Switching gears on you a little bit, Mr. Secretary, what progress has the Department of Defense made in their efforts to address the Pfas, PFOA cleanup, particularly in locations that maybe have a more immediate need? You know, I realize that the DOD is not the EPA here, and this is not going to be shouldered by the responsibility totally by the DOD. But what are you doing to keep up the inertia in the PFAS cleanup?
This is a nationwide problem, and DOD's been leading on it. Within, I think, the first 24, 48 hours of being sworn as Secretary of Defense, I chartered a DOD task force on PFAS, PFOA. They've been working for some time now, giving me updates. I hope to submit a report to this committee, to the Congress here in the next couple weeks. We've been closely engaged with EPA, supporting, we're going to abide by whatever standard they set. But I think there's a few things we need to do. We need to get a replacement for the firefighting foam. Number two, we need to make sure that we understand the impacts on our people, our communities, people, people outside our gate. And then number three, we need to just keep moving forward with regard to understanding how to mitigate it going forward. And that's kind of the commitment we've made, and you'll get my report soon in terms of where we stand on this.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Slotkin.
Just continuing on the issue of PFAS, since you have two Michiganders going right after each other, thank you for setting up that task force as soon as you came in. That was a great thing, and I was really pleased that on a bipartisan basis in last year's Pentagon budget, we passed the first 6 provisions into law dealing with PFAS that did anything more than just study the problem, including laying down the marker that you have to be off by 2024, off of PFAS firefighting foam, which is great. And to Representative Bergman's point, you're not the EPA, and EPA has not done its job in setting a standard for what's safe and not what's not safe, so you can't live up to that standard that doesn't exist. My question is this: based on DOD regulation, you all are required to live up to state environmental standards. The state of Michigan is currently reviewing setting up our own statewide PFAS standard. Once enacted and officially promulgated, will you commit to living up to Michigan's statewide standards?
I think if that's our regulation driven by law, we'd be required to, but let me come back and give you a formal answer to make sure.
Yeah, I think the people of Michigan would love a formal answer, because
Right.
we're moving ahead.
I'm a lawyer.
It's happening. It's happening.
Okay.
Switching gears, I want to associate myself with Representative Thornberry's comments about the budget. And I want to take the conversation away from the wall and not the wall. People can have a big, healthy debate, and we certainly have, about the value of the wall. But I do have to note that there's an issue of precedent here. You're the first confirmed Secretary of Defense to ever voluntarily move money out of his own budget against the will of the Oversight Defense Committees. And that precedent is important for you, but it's important for every Secretary of Defense to come. So I'm concerned that we're going to become the piggy bank. The Pentagon is going to become the piggy bank for any pet project. Today it could be the wall. Tomorrow it could be someone's decision to fund a healthcare project exclusively out of DOD's budget. And I think I appreciate that you say you want to work with Congress and that you respect us, but you don't if in the end of the day, the money that we have appropriated is going for something else. The second issue, and I think you leave us no choice but to look at what we can do to constrain your reprogramming authority. And this kills me, because I used to be at the Pentagon and I relied desperately on that reprogramming authority, but you've put us in a situation where to uphold our constitutional oath and the separation of powers, we have to exert our authority, and I'm sorry to say that. On where you're taking that money from, of the $3.9 billion that you've asked to take away, $1.5 billion of it is from the Guard and Reserve, and Michigan is exclusively Guard and Reserve. And you say that is all excess to need, including all the equipment upgrades and requests. Can you say directly to the National Guardsmen and Reservists in Michigan why they're going to be 34% of the bill to pay for the movement of money? Please speak directly to them on why all that equipment is excess to need.
Well, it's excess to need in the sense that that's what was reported to me based on DOD budget in 20. Our assessment, I had a chance to speak with all the service secretaries about this. There was agreement along the same lines. I take my recommendation from the chairman here about his advice. But look, I say it not as a former soldier, but also a former guardsman. I get it. I understand. But we had sources we had to fill, and we tried to be very not arbitrary. We tried to be very objective in terms of where we took the sources. Okay. And the clearest source was early to need or excess to request.
Okay. I'm really concerned that you guys haven't done internal work on coronavirus. I was at the Pentagon when we were dealing with Ebola, and we didn't want to get involved, and then we had to get involved because the crisis was looming. And I would note that the president's request for coronavirus supplemental funds is $2.5 billion against the $10 billion that he's requested and moved to the wall. Tell me what you're going to do to make sure you're on this so that we understand your needs now, since there are some concerning reports that this could turn into a pandemic.
No, it's, as I said to Mr. Crow, we owe you a quick response on this. This continues to evolve rapidly. We've been very engaged for several weeks now, not just internally, but in the interagency. And so I appreciate the offer, and we'll get that back to you soonest in terms of just anticipating leaning forward into it.
Thank you. And then lastly, I just was a little confused on your answer on climate change. I sort of heard from General Milley that, yes, you believe it's a national security threat. Secretary Esper, you were more caveated. The Pentagon itself, your own staffs, put out a report in 2014 that climate change has an impact on national security. Even just like more superstorms, et cetera, means more guardsmen and more reservists. Can you say yes or no? Do you believe climate change is a threat to national security?
So what you just said, Congresswoman, is different, and I agree that climate change creates impacts on national security. The specific question was, do I define it as a national security threat? I don't in my traditional thinking about how I identify national security threats.
General Milley?
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, what I said, it has second and third order impacts on national security. I think the significant national security threats to the United States the Department of Defense needs to focus on is China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and terrorists. And we can't do everything for everyone. There's a lot of threats. There's infrastructure, there's the education system, there's climate change, healthcare system. There's all kinds of threats, all of which could be bundled theoretically under the rubric of national security. But I think climate change has impacts that result in national security challenges, such as resource constraints, instability, and those sorts of things in different parts of the world. Absolutely. So there's second and third order impacts. There's national security challenges as a result. But the threats as I define them are right in accordance with that NDS.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Chairman Milley, for being here today. To follow on some of my colleagues on Corona, I just want to be clear. We have a soldier in South Korea that has, but from reporting, self-quarantined. Mr. Secretary, have you given guidance to U.S. Forces Korea to limit the movement of soldiers and their families, understanding that this virus is very asymptomatic, that people can carry it? We don't know the exposure levels. People can carry it for weeks. Are you prepared, or have you given guidance, or are you giving guidance to limit the back and forth of those soldiers and families?
I've given guidance to the commanders with regard to protection of the force and making sure that we can continue our mission. General Abrams and also Admiral Davidson have acted very aggressively. Abrams has taken action already with regard to limiting certain things, controlling the gates, who's coming through and all that. They're very attuned to this.
I understand protecting the force there, but protecting the transmission back home through via our military.
Yes, it's not just local with regard to the commander on the peninsula, but it's also, again, the Indo-PACOM commander and our own folks at the OSD, PNR, in terms of how we manage this and making sure it doesn't escape us. And in fact, I got another update this morning from General Abrams on this particular issue.
Thank you, appreciate it. So just to follow on Chairman Smith's opening comments, and I think this is important that we begin talking about our competition with China this way, that we may be in a post-Cold War strategy, but I don't think Moscow or Beijing ever got that message, that they are currently in a Cold War with us. They're explicit, particularly the Chinese, in their desire to supplant the United States. It's a whole-of-government effort, taking advantage of our free markets, our universities, international institutions such as the EU and the UN. This is a concerted effort. Would you agree with me that actually the strength of the United States, but also of our adversary, China, is their economy, much more much more so than necessarily the military strength?
Yeah, I spoke to this in Munich last week. What concerns me, people like to make comparisons between China and the USSR, the big difference, or China and Russia. The big difference is the economic might and potential of China as compared to Russia. That could really feed their economy, their military, their innovation, et cetera.
So would you share my concern? I mean, we have the largest RT&D budget ever, which I think is a great thing, but I'm also concerned that we're funding Beijing's research and development. So would you share my concern that a lot of those dollars are going to institutions where we don't know if their faculty, their researchers, and many of the Chinese students are part of the talents program, and where that research is going? Will you share that concern that on the one hand we have such a large budget, on the other hand we could be funding our adversary.
I'm concerned about espionage, obviously, IP theft, theft of our cyber systems, and I'm concerned about research that
Would
we
you
sponsor.
support legislation that limits institutions from receiving federal dollars, particularly DoD dollars, if they have faculty that are part of the Chinese talents program?
I don't know enough about the legislation or the Chinese talents program, but I'm very concerned about Chinese students in America or professors in America that have access to our research.
Would you share my concern differently on markets that U.S. pensioners and some of our biggest pension programs, including the Thrift Savings Plan, are providing billions of dollars to Chinese companies, many of them in China's defense industry? So essentially, indirectly, U.S. pensioners are funding the Chinese defense buildup?
You know,
would you agree with that characterization?
I've worked on this issue in the past about China using our capital markets and others to fund their activities. Again, it's something I'd want to understand better before commenting. But I am concerned about Americans or groups providing the capital that China needs to invest.
Should we limit the TSP from investing in Chinese firms, particularly those that are funding the defense program?
I know, Congressman, I appreciate you wanting an affirmative answer, but I'd like to understand things and get my facts right and my data and my arguments before I commit to something.
Totally understandable. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Quickly, Mr. Chairman, on Afghanistan. I think the concern from Ms. Cheney, myself, and others is that the signal that we are prepared to draw down and withdraw from Afghanistan, the signal sent now, even if that is at some point in the near future, could cause a fracturing of the government, by extension a fracturing of the Army, which to me is the canary in the coal mine with the ethnic tensions, and essentially put us back to 2001. But here's my concern. Would you agree in your military advice that the Taliban has the capability, so let's assume they have the will to enter into a peaceful political process, how do they have the capability to enforce the agreement and keep al-Qaeda and ISIS at bay, where we have struggled, the coalition has struggled, and a 300,000-man Afghan army has struggled? So do you think they have the military capability to keep al-Qaeda and ISIS suppressed?
Unfortunately, at this point,
in the wake of a withdrawal?
That's going to have to be taken for the record because we're comfortably over time at this point. So you'll have to get back to him on that. Ms. Escobar.
Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you so much for sticking around and for being here all morning with us. Thank you for your testimony and your service. This is a hearing to focus on the budget, and I heard some things, a couple things that were alarming to me, and I'd like to drill down a little bit on them, in particular about the wall and the reprogramming of the funds that were appropriated by Congress. I represent El Paso, Texas, home to Fort Bliss, our second largest military installation, a critical key asset to our national defense. And so the juxtaposition of what we're dealing with is not lost on me, the kind of profound disconnect for me, that while we have investments that are badly needed, strategic investments that should be made at Fort Bliss, like a rail yard that could help, or rail improvements that are critical to Defender 20, and we have infrastructure that has been deemed unsafe, money is being pulled for a wall that is preventing moms and babies and dads and their children from seeking asylum protection in the United States, and that somehow is key to our national security. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Secretary, how will you ensure that a community like mine and Fort Bliss, that our soldiers who serve at Fort Bliss are not asked to rely on unsafe infrastructure when that money is being diverted for a wall that is keeping out those moms and babies and those fathers and children?
Well, Congresswoman, we wouldn't put any service member in a situation where it affects life, health, and safety. If you're aware of something like that, I'd like to know, frankly, because then I could follow up with the Secretary of the Army. But life, health, and safety issues immediately popped to the top of my list of things that we would want to make sure that we understand, but that has not been reported to me, so I'd like to follow up with you if that's the case, if you have something like that.
Okay, I'll definitely follow up with that. How does a border wall improve our strategic capabilities?
Well, the purpose of the wall, obviously, is to secure the border from illicit activity, whether it's trafficking of human persons, whether it's criminal trespassing, or whether it's, for example, it's counter-narcotics. In fact, in the case of the sources just drawn up, it comes under the 284 account, which is counter-narcotics. So that's the purpose, is to put a border up there so our Border Patrol can respond more effectively and quickly to make sure we prevent those elements from coming across the border.
Well, the funding is being pulled not just from those accounts, is that correct?
It's pulled from the excess to need, early to need accounts through the counter-narcotics. Where we've been asked to support DHS is on parts of the border that are these routes for counter-narcotics to come across.
And I actually, one of the things that I heard from you was about the funding being pulled from projects that were ahead of or in excess of need. And when one of my colleagues asked you, I think it was Ms. Davis, asked in more detail about that funding, you said, well, Congress put it there.
That's right.
And so are you essentially telling us that we overprogrammed in those cases?
Well, this is not unusual going back decades. But, you know, if we ask for 3 F-35s and you provide 5, we consider those 2 as additional excess to need in that budget year.
And I appreciate that, and I don't mean to interrupt, I apologize, it's just 5 minutes goes very quickly. So as we're looking to plus up programs that we believe are critical to our national defense or critical to helping reinforce the mission that we all share, it would be very helpful for us to know in advance where we see an excess of need. And, you know, obviously we know where some of those areas are, but I feel like this excess of need component essentially enables the president's, what I consider his usurping of congressional authority and usurping the will of the people. And so any help that we could get as we try to determine what those plus-ups are, and then we have to look for those offsets. Would love your ideas on where we can find those offsets to better utilize that money so that the wall debate can be had with within the Committee on the Department of Homeland Security and not the Committee for Armed Services. My time is up. I have a number of other questions, but I'll follow up separately with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lauria.
Well, thank you, and thank you both gentlemen for staying long enough to get to the last person and our newest member, Mr. Brindisi, as well. Leading up to this hearing, I wanted to understand the data-driven approach that I thought DOD would be using to develop their budget request, and in doing that, I referenced 2 documents produced by your department. One is the annual performance plan, and the other is the annual performance report. Are you familiar with and have you reviewed those documents, and were they used in guiding your submission to this committee?
I am aware of them. I have not reviewed them recently, and I'd have to defer to my staff. I can get you an answer whether it was used.
There's just a couple things that stood out in there to me. The first strategic objective in this document says that we should restore military readiness to build a more lethal force. I think that sounds like a great objective. We can all agree with that.
It's the first line of effort in our strategy.
Yes. But I'll dig down because I thought I would find some great metrics because this is a performance report and the goal is that you use last year's budget. How did you accomplish that? Where are we this year? And therefore that's justifying the next requests that you're making to achieve those goals. So the number 1 priority goal, 1.1.1, says to improve the department's ability to measure, assess, and understand readiness. All of us who've served, we're familiar with the DERS system. I'm assuming that it's referring to that. And so it's 2020, and our goal is still to figure out how to report our readiness. And I even found a 1998 GAO study on military readiness that actually says in 1998 that for more than a decade, various audits and oversight organizations have questioned the thoroughness and reliability of DoD reports on readiness. So you add all this up, I'm not great at math here, but over 30 years, we've been trying to figure out how to report our readiness. And then, you know, digging in further in your budget outline, you've specifically say that you're going to give $125 billion to readiness, and then within each service, Army $3.4 billion, Navy, Marine Corps $2.7, Air Force $1.7, additional funds to readiness. And also in your comments today, you said you support the Navy's decision to fund readiness. But if we can't even find out, if we don't even know what our readiness is, if we don't even know where, do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. I think one of the changes I made when I came in is to get a better accounting of readiness. So we've changed the system. And we're making a lot of great progress working between OSD and the joint staff. Where we
But
measure.
it's still your #1 objective is to actually figure out what readiness is?
No, I think we have good metrics on readiness. We now assess it based on our immediate reaction
So this
force.
document is maybe not accurate?
Could be dated because we've, at least since I've been on the job now 9 months, we're continuing to evolve the process and make changes. So we better understand, based on war plans, contingency plans, what do we need and when do we need it, so that we're prepared to put that at a highest readiness level, a second readiness level, et cetera.
Okay, so I appreciate that feedback. You feel like you have improvement, you have a better idea of readiness. It just was not reflected in this document, which was portrayed as being part of the process in developing the budget. So that was unclear to me. And I do want to associate myself with the comments from Mr. Courtney, Mr. Whitman, Mr. Gallagher about a concern about the direction we're going as far as shipbuilding, ship construction, especially if we haven't seen the 30-year shipbuilding plan. I won't reiterate at any length my concern about the optimized fleet response plan. I know that a study is forthcoming, and you indicated in the next couple of weeks that I'll look forward
I think you and I agree on this issue. So.
Yes, and also the importance of strategic Sealift specifically, and just pointing out the scale of that investment. I know that the plan, I spoke with the CNO yesterday, is to buy 2 used ships next year, 1 the additional year. But if you look at the importance of strategic Sealift to get 90% of our ground forces overseas into the fight, for about $1.5 to $2 billion, we could buy all of the ships we need used, yet we don't prioritize that because we buy all this equipment, we can't get it there. And I know, General Milley, if you could expand a little bit in the time remaining, that you seem to indicate that we would just expand the tip fib. We would just look at the way to get the forces to Korea, and if we don't have enough ships to get them there in the time that we've planned for, we would just take longer. Is that something that you're reevaluating the whole O plan around not having strategic Sealift as designed?
Well, when we evaluate risk, when I have to submit my chairman's risk assessment, it's based on the ability of us to be able to do our task, military task, the mission, to be able to do that at an acceptable level of cost, express in the lives of troops, and do it in accordance with time. The time is a function of getting there on time with strategic lift, and that's going to be stretched out.
I'm sorry to interrupt, I understand that you guys are running short of time, and I do want to give Mr. Brindisi a quick chance before we get you out of here. So we're going to have to cut that off. Mr. Brindisi, go ahead.
Chairman's always correcting the chairman on time.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Esper, Chairman Milley, thank you so much for sticking around to hear from me, the low man here. You have terrific endurance to make it through all this, so thank you. Real quick, I wanted to ask you, the National Defense Strategy outlines that we must prioritize R&D and emerging technologies like quantum and AI because China is investing very heavily in those areas. Secretary, do you feel that we're investing adequate resources to keep pace with China?
In the 2 areas that you mentioned, I do. There's those 2, and there's 9 other areas where we've noted as critical technologies for the future, and we're putting as much as we can into those systems and trying to accelerate development.
Okay. And I want to ask, too, because I have an Air Force research laboratory in my district in Rome, New York, and in this year's NDAA, last year's NDAA, we established a Quantum Information Science Innovation Center there to really help leverage partnerships between DoD, academia, and industry. Can you talk to me a little bit about the importance of those kinds of partnerships in this area?
I think it gets to the issue we discussed earlier about having a broad innovation base and making sure we're tapping all potential resources, whether it's not just the traditional, big defense companies, but also academia, small innovators, entrepreneurs, the whole broad range to make sure we can deliver the very best for our warfighters.
Okay. And then I want to talk a little bit about counter-UAS. I'm specifically concerned about what our adversaries are up to, and I wanted to ask, because this same research lab in Rome is doing a lot of great work developing counter-UAS technologies to mitigate these threats from our adversaries. So Secretary Esper, Chairman Milley, can you speak briefly about how the services are postured to address the UAS threat?
It is a challenging threat that's constantly evolving, in many cases quicker than we can respond. We had all services moving out on a number of different programs. I consolidated that last year. We made the Army the executive agent, and now they're pulling together a much more focused effort that looks at fewer systems but tries to accelerate them. But we need to get to the point where it's much less hardware-based but software-based and going back to the roots so we can kind of stay ahead of the enemy instead of playing catch-up with regard to, and there's different systems. We have to have systems that we can use back here in the States, systems we can use overseas with partner countries, and then there's systems we need to be able to use on the battlefield.
Chairman Milley.
So the threat is increasing significantly in the unmanned aerial systems, and this threat not only applies to nation states like China and Russia and Iran, North Korea, but terrorist organizations are also increasing the use of unmanned aerial systems. So we're putting a fair amount of money, I think, in the development of ground-based counter-UAS systems, and we're getting them deployed. And in fact, we're using some of them right now in the various locations like Afghanistan and Iraq.
Can you talk, to the extent you can talk about it, what collaboration is there with private industry right now around that? Because I could tell you that the lab that's in the district that I represent is right next door to an FAA test site for unmanned aerial research, and really the 50-mile radius that they have to test drones in upstate New York seems to be in an ideal location, located right next door to an Air Force research laboratory that's doing all this counter-UAS work. What kind of collaborations are taking place between DoD and private industry?
I know there is collaboration. I can't give you the specifics. I'd have to come back to you with specific collaboration incident or examples of collaboration, but I know there is collaboration with industry, and all of these systems are built by the commercial industry. So all we do is lay on requirements and then start funding the research development, but all that's done by the commercial industry.
Okay. And Secretary Esper, can you?
I think we need to take that back, Congressman, and give you a response, and I'll pass along to the Air Force as well when they come up to testify.
That'd be great. I'd love to invite you up there at some point in time to Rome if you ever want to see the work they're doing at the lab there, the Air Force Research Laboratory and the test site right next door there. I think there's a lot that can be done, and certainly they're on the cutting edge of a lot of the counter-UAS technology that's taking place.
Good. Thank you.
Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we are over time. All I have time left is Ms. Spear did have a quick question about TBI, which has not been covered yet, that I think would be helpful if we could just do that reasonably quickly. I will yield to Ms. Spear for those questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, there was a total of 109 service members that were identified as having TBIs after the bombing in Iraq. Could you give us an update on how many are have been diagnosed, and what's the status of their conditions?
Item number one, Congresswoman, it's first priority for us is taking care of our service members, making sure they have medical needs are met and they recover expeditiously. I think number two, I think the number is up to 112 right now.
112.
Based on what happened. This was a new challenge to us. It's the first time we've seen our service members subject to a ballistic missile attack with 1,000-pound plus warhead, so we're learning things. And I've met with the Joint Staff Surgeon to talk about this in terms of understanding how these symptoms manifest themselves over time, what it means. Might it change how we categorize, take care of them, et cetera, et cetera. But the good news is 70% have been returned to duty. The remainder are, some have returned home, some stay in Germany, but 70% have returned to duty and they've all been mild TBI, I think, is the assessment.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very, very much. The only closing comments I have are two things that were raised during the hearing. One, there was a couple of times when it was raised that we need to hit 3 to 5% above inflation in the defense budget in order to meet the national defense strategy. Highly unlikely, as you know, that we're going to hit that 3 to 5% number. So it might be appropriate to rethink aspects of the NDS and see what makes sense in keeping with the overall theme of making sure that our means match our desired ends. The other thing is on the nuclear piece. This is something we're going to fight over here in the budget because the $2.5 billion that was added to the NNSA is a big part of what's got Mr. Courtney and Mr. Whitman so upset, and rightfully so, and that we canceled an attack submarine as part of that. At the same time, and I hope it was understood that what Mrs. Davis was saying was she wasn't questioning the importance of the nuclear deterrent. It is incredibly important. There is, however, $8 billion in what they artfully refer to as uncosted balances, currently within the NNSA for programs authorized and appropriated for over years. If we got $8 billion hanging out in there that we haven't spent as planned, I question the wisdom of grabbing $2.5 billion to add to that, just to make us feel like we're doing more, particularly at the cost of the very difficult battle we have over making sure we have enough submarines and ships overall. With that, I'll yield to Mr. Thornberry for any closing comments he might have.
Mr. Chairman, I would just say I think it is also incumbent upon the Secretary and the Chairman to tell us what they think we need to spend. And if we don't provide it, then we have some of the responsibility for the consequences that come with that. Finally, I would just say on the unobligated balances, I think it's up to us to dig deeper into exactly where those funds come from. Are they intended for a particular purpose, a construction project that's delayed, a weapon refurbishment, for example, that's been delayed, and I know we've got some of that. So it is more into the details that'll be important. But I appreciate our witnesses being here.
I think that's a legitimate point. I will point out we had, some frustration on missile defense along these lines as well, that we were sort of getting ahead of our skis. So we got to have missile defense, we got to have missile defense. So we poured a bunch of money into things. We just, canceled the program after spending $2 billion and determining that it didn't work. That's the kind of thing we want to try to avoid in this area. I thank you very much for your patience in getting through as many members as we did, and appreciate your service and look forward to continuing to work with you. And with that, we are adjourned. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman.
Passing by.